Well, good morning, everyone. Can I welcome you to the 24th meeting in 2013 of the Infrastructure and Capital Investment Committee. Can I remind everyone to switch off their mobile phones as they do affect the broadcasting system. But having said that, some members of the committee will be using their tablets because they have their papers electronically or in digital format. Agenda item 1 is the Procurement-Reform Scotland Bill. And today we will hear evidence from two panels of stakeholders on this bill. The first panel is made up of business representative groups in Scotland. So can I welcome Gary Clark, Head of Policy and Public Affairs of the Scottish Chamber of Commerce, Susan Love, Policy Manager for the Federation of Small Businesses, and Anthony Rush, Infrastructure and Environment Group from the Confederation of British Industry, Scotland. So can I start off by asking you, ladies and gentlemen, will the bill deliver the government's policy objectives of establishing systems which are transparent, streamlined, standardised, proportionate, fair and business friendly? And Gary, if you'd like to start.
I think certainly the bill is a welcome part of a long process which has been going on for many years now in terms of improving accessibility to procurement for many businesses. I think that certainly perhaps some of the measures we would have hoped perhaps had been implemented by now we view as maybe areas which could have been where reform could have been implemented without necessarily recourse to legislation, that we could have changed procedures without going through a legislative route in some cases. But nevertheless, I think the bill does represent a statement of good faith in terms of the approach of government to procurement. Successive Scottish governments and Scottish executives have taken the issue very seriously. I think from a business point of view, our members really want to see progress and want to see progress quickly at this stage.
Okay, we'll get on to particular areas of where you want to see progress in a minute. Susan.
I think the bill is an important step in setting out the behaviour that we expect of public bodies when they're buying goods and services. So it sets out the standards we expect in terms of transparency, proportionality and how those are to be achieved. So it's a good first step in setting out the basics of how those principles should be adhered to, but I think realistically it's not going to solve every single problem that every supplier has overnight.
Yes, because everybody wants to win the contract. Anthony Rush.
Yeah, there are some positive proposals in the bill to reduce the burden on the tenderer, and we welcome those. Proposals like the streamlining the PPQ system. And some of the measures will promote consistency and tendering best practice, and we welcome that. But it's sometimes better to stick to best practice rather than trying to reinvent it. But we're uneasy about the draft bill. On the face of it, it opens up contracting authorities to damages arising from failure to perform duties which could be easily set out in guidance, and there is already guidance in place and regulation in place which could be followed. The effectiveness of the bill is wholly reliant on further guidance and regulation and orders by the Scottish Government or by the administration. And until we've seen those new orders and guidance in detail, it's very difficult for us to constructively comment on whether this bill will be effective or not and meet its aims.
That's more or less the same with any bill, that the details are set out in further legislation and guidance, and obviously that has to take into account EU regulations that are coming on procurement as well. So
I think that come on to threshold. The EU regulations will relate will relate to contracts above the thresholds. This bill relates to contracts below those thresholds, essentially. I accept that further regulation and orders is not unusual, but in my experience, the volume of and importance of the new regulations and orders in this bill are relatively unprecedented, and before we can comment on whether this is good law or not, we would have to see what they are.
Okay, Mary, would you like to carry on?
Thank you, Convener. Good morning. Overall, do you think that the bill will assist business, both SME and larger businesses, to bid and win public contracts?
Yes, overall. Would we rather have a bill than not have a bill? Yes. Will it make it slightly better than not having the bill? Yes. But as I said, it won't, of itself, it won't transform things overnight for small businesses to bid, but it will help.
I think I would probably agree with that. As I say, legislation is one route, and this is part of a long journey we've been on. There have been improvements steadily over the years. I think from our members' point of view, we would have liked to have seen more rapid progress. But that said, I think it is a welcome step along the way of enshrining an approach to procurement that recognises the issues that small businesses in particular have in this process. So from that point of view, it's a positive step.
I think the bill should make it easier for people to bid for contracts, public contracts. Whether it will achieve its aims of getting more SMEs to win contracts or more third sector I think is questionable. And we'll have to wait and see the outcome. Of course, I mean, the Scottish Government's own statistics show that SMEs are already performing quite well, and I think there is a danger that this bill could be discriminatory. And we mentioned the EU before. I mean, EU directives are intended to open up borders. I think there's a danger from this bill that we're putting up barriers.
When you say putting up barriers, is that specifically for SMEs or?
No, I think there's a danger that we're putting up barriers to companies that are not rated as SMEs, and we're also in danger in some of the exclusions. I think in section 22, in erecting barriers there, section 22 and 23, in erecting barriers. So I think one's got to be cautious about this. But the intention of making it easier to bid and easier to pre-qualify, I think is long overdue and very welcome, and will be good practice.
Does anyone want to come back in on that specific point about just, the barriers that are going to be there?
I think we might have some quite a long way to go before we can say that large multinational businesses have got unfair barriers put in their way for procurement in Scotland as a result of this bill.
Yeah. Well, fair point, Bill. And are the proposals in the bill, including which level of procurement they apply to, clear and easy to understand? Susan?
Do you mean in terms of the threshold?
In terms of the way companies bid and how you get into the process and threshold, Chip?
I think there's been a lot of work done to try and improve awareness for businesses of how the system works. Will the bill help that? Yes, if depending on how individual bodies set out measures to help open up access for SMEs through their strategies. So it will depend on what they put in place to make sure that they use some of the good tools that are out there to help explain the process to small businesses.
I think the structures look about right in terms of, as I say, the progress that has been made to date in terms of opening up opportunities through Public Contracts Scotland, etc. The structures are definitely improving, and it's certainly making contracts more accessible to small business. I think, as others have said, the proof of the pudding will be in the eating, and we need to ensure that more and more SMEs are actually picking up the contracts. So yes, I think the legislation creates the right structures to allow that to happen, but it still needs to happen. once the legislation is in place.
Yeah, so there's more work to
and
be done.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
we need to ensure we're making proper measurements to ensure that the bill is having the desired effect.
Okay.
I think I agree with my colleagues on all of that, and I'm probably a little bit more optimistic. I think there has been good progress made in procurement systems in Scotland. I think they're very welcome. What I think we would like to see, and what we would advise, is to have more consistency and more standardisation throughout procurement, including forms of contract and as well as methods of procurement. And I think that should be a result of adopting these proposals, that you'll get more consistency, and that'll safeguard the public purse better.
And do you think there's a job there for the guidance then? The guidance to fit into this whole process?
I think there is guidance there.
Yeah.
I think the guidance has to be read. I have to admit, my view right through this process has been that this is legislation which is not necessary. I think the guidance is there if it's followed, but I think the benefit of this sort of approach, and the approach that the administration is taking on procurement, is that it should create consistency and standardisation. The problems that I've been involved in public procurement have mainly been where the contracting authority is stepped away from standardisation and consistency and adopted some new idea on procurement.
Okay. Any other comments on that? No?
As Gary mentioned earlier, I mean, I think it is fair to say that a number of the measures in the bill are things that ordinarily you wouldn't have to expect to legislate on, but these tools and this guidance have been available for quite some considerable time, and yet there are many public bodies who still don't use it, and they're technically not breaking any rules, so what can be done? So we find ourselves in a situation where they have to be made rules to use these, so that suppliers know what to expect and can expect a consistent standard of service from our buying bodies.
Yeah, and probably to add to that, I think a lot of issues that businesses bring forward in terms of where they've had a problem in the procurement process, it sometimes comes down to perhaps individual attitudes on the purchasing authority side, and whilst yes, as I've said already, we would have, a lot of this could have been done without legislation. Perhaps legislation is helpful in terms of giving purchasing authorities the confidence to be able to, maybe making to give the contract to a small local business, which is where we'd like it to be in many cases.
Thank you, Convener.
I mean, Gary, you said we've come a long way already. What are the good practices that we need more people to adopt, whether it be tenderers or contracting authorities?
Well, I think we've come a long way, over an extended period of time. Going back to the McClelland report, which is 7-8 years ago now, and through the work of the Supplier Engagement Working Group, which was set up in 2010, and our Chief Executive, Liz Cameron, has chaired that. We've certainly made progress in terms of the Public Contract Scotland website, the visibility, the accessibility that provides in terms of many but not all public contracts in Scotland, and also in terms of making progress towards the standardised PQQ, which I think for small businesses in particular, has been a barrier in order to access contracts for some time, because it is a burdensome process. And Scottish Chambers of Commerce is a small business. We have, we do participate in public contracts, and we have been successful in operating some of those. We've also, as a result, been through the procurement process at the public level. And we can certainly speak from experience about the volume and intensity of work that is required to go through a process which may ultimately be fruitless. But I think we made good progress in terms of lowering some of those barriers for business, making public contracts more open and accessible and transparent. But there's still a long way to go in terms of getting the numbers we would like in terms of SMEs participating and winning public contracts and supporting local jobs.
Okay. Alex.
Thank you, Convener. Given some of the answers, we've had questions already. Could I ask a simple one, and that is, do you support the introduction of the new regime for below EU threshold contracts?
Yes.
Okay.
Right, we've had 2 yeses.
Interesting question. As we've said, I mean, we support anything that makes tendering, pre-qualifying and tendering for public contracts easier. And I think there is there has been a need for it. I mean, and the administration should be congratulated for going that far. I am wary of some of the provisions of this bill. And I don't know how they'll work out. I think the idea of tying the non-conformance with the procedures to the danger of civil action could be a negative step.
Maybe the next question I need to ask, and this is to all of you, not just to yourself, but what are the implications of the thresholds for the businesses you represent?
I suppose we represent more major business, or seem to represent more major businesses than the small businesses. So and there's the small business representation here. So if you forgive me, I'll speak for large businesses rather than the business community as a whole. I don't think the thresholds. I mean, I can't see what else they could have done with thresholds. If you're going to have thresholds, then I mean, you can't go above the EU thresholds. So you have to set a limit below thresholds. What just strikes me as a possibility when there's a question of the danger of legal action against an authority, that they may well look to tailor their procurement out with the 2 thresholds. They could put contracts, multiple contracts, up above the threshold into the EU, or reduce contracts sizes to below the threshold so that they don't risk legal sanction. And I think that's a possibility. I mean, I'm old enough to be cynical, but be forgiven for being cynical on these things. But I think that is a possibility. Having said that, I don't think there is that much flexibility for them to do it, possibly. But overall, you've got to make up your mind whether this is the best value for the taxpayer.
Yeah. So who's the FSB and the Chamber of Commerce thinking about that?
I think in terms of where you set a threshold for these new rules for Scotland, it had to be lower than the current EU threshold. Most FSB members, most small businesses are not going to be bidding for contracts that are currently covered by the EU, above the EU threshold levels, by and large. They're going to be dealing with much lower value contracts. So you have to have it lower than that. Equally, you have to recognise that not every single process can be applied to every single contract. You are, of course, going to have lighter regulations for very low value contracts, because it just wouldn't be efficient otherwise. And so the question is, where do you draw that line? I think the threshold that's been drawn, £50,000 for supplies, is fair, seems reasonable, bearing in mind that contract could be spread over a number of years, so it could actually be a lower value spend each year. So it could be, say, £20,000 in a year that a small business is delivering. So I think that's fair. I understand that the public bodies will feel that it might place additional requirements on them that might have resource implications, so I'm prepared to accept that we go with 50k. Equally, most small businesses will be bidding for work substantially below that 50k threshold. When they're talking about low value spend, they'll be talking at sub 10k spend. And we have to make sure that we do shine a light on the processes below the £50,000 threshold as well. So whereas we wouldn't expect every single check and balance to be applied to all contracts, there are some aspects of the bill that we would like to see cover all spending. So elements of procurement strategies, that should cover all of an organisation's spending, including their below 50k spending, to make sure that the good practice we want to see applies across the organisation's buying and not just to contracts that are above 50,000.
Yeah, I mean, I think as others have said, the threshold has to be drawn somewhere. The £50,000 threshold seems, in terms of the broad scope of contracts in coming from the public sector, seems to be an appropriate place to draw that threshold. And certainly we don't have any major issues with that.
The final thing I was going to ask about the thresholds was, how were businesses consulted by the government prior to the introduction of the bill? Do you feel there was enough consultation went on in order to establish the thresholds?
Consultation is one of these issues that the beauty is in the eye of the beholder. On this particular bill, I think the procurement team or the bill team should be congratulated. I think they did an extremely thorough job on consultation, where they obviously learnt and didn't just box tick. On the question of thresholds, I actually can't remember in the consultation how important that was, and the advisory groups that I've sat on here, I actually can't remember much discussion on thresholds, I have to say. But as far as consultation is concerned, I think this particular bill has been an exemplar for consultation.
There have been many discussions and consultations over recent years about how you would apply different rules, where they should apply. So I think there have been a lot of discussion about the levels of contracts that are important to small businesses. Don't recall a specific discussion recently about whether 50,000 should be the threshold for regulated contracts. I think there was a question in the consultation about what would define major contracts rather than the regulated contracts. So I can't say that I can recall a very specific recent consultation about that point.
I mean, I think certainly that, as I've mentioned already, it's a process which has gone on for many years. The government has engaged with the business community very frequently and in depth through the Supplier Engagement Working Group and others. We did have some issues actually with the formal consultation for the bill when it came out, but and I don't recall us actually putting in any recommendations with regard to thresholds as part of that formal consultation. But that said, there's been a host of consultation that's gone on over many years between the Scottish Government and the business community in Scotland on this and other issues.
Nevertheless, the outcome on thresholds is about right in your view. Is that
about right?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, you can't say it's wrong.
Thank you.
Okay, we move on to part 2 then, which is general duties and procurement strategies. Gordon?
Thanks, Convener. On the subject of the proposed sustainable procurement duty, the contracting authority must consider how it can improve the economic, social and environmental well-being of the authority's area and also facilitate the involvement of small and medium enterprises. Do you think the bill will achieve these aims, and if not, what changes would you like to see so that these objectives can be achieved?
I think that that expression is a very good starting point, and it certainly reflects the issues we would like to see addressed in terms of the value of giving contracts to SMEs within a local area. It reflects the true economic value potentially. of that kind of award, and that's certainly something we have spoken for many years about, and we want to see that true reflection of economic value contained. Clearly, it's welcome that those provisions are within the bill. Certainly, speaking to many purchasing authorities, many of them would like to feel more confident about being able to make decisions like that, but up till now perhaps haven't had the reassurance necessary they have required from Scottish Government to allow that to happen. I think enshrining that sort of proposal in legislation has a positive benefit. I think, it remains to be seen whether it will have the required effect and whether it will change processes and decision-making within the purchasing authority. But I think enshrining that in legislation is a positive step towards allowing more SMEs to participate in the public procurement process.
Yeah, I think just in answering this, I'm just reflecting on how some of the public bodies have reacted to this and how they feel about it. And there just seems to be quite a strong sort of feeling that we're already doing this. Public bodies already achieve all of these duties. We're already super duper in terms of our support for SMEs, but then go on to say why they shouldn't have to deal with these duties. So I'm a bit confused if they think they're already achieving it, why they would be concerned about this. I suppose what we want to see happen with this duty is to move from a kind of general statement of support for these principles, which I think all buying bodies would say they already are signed up to this and they already have some elements of their buying habits that says they meet this. We want to move from that into embedding these processes and principles more into their routine buying. That's the challenge of where we are at procurement in the moment. So there are some fantastic projects going on just now. Some great projects where a whole range of sustainable procurement principles have been put into place, whether it's through training or sustainability or involving local contractors. But we need to see that approach reflected in the day-to-day buying that's going on. So from our point of view, how the guidance is drawn up for this, particularly in relation to the strategies that will be expected, that will be absolutely critical to how this duty actually delivers on the ground.
In terms of that point, are you saying that the most contracting authorities need to review their whole procurement procedure that's maybe developed over a long number of years and has maybe become a standard tick box exercise, and therefore they have to review it in order to ensure that these aims are enshrined in it? Is that really what you're suggesting?
I've read procurement strategies where there are paragraphs written about, our organisation wants to support more SMEs, we've got a great record on this, and we'll run some supplier development programmes, and that's it. Now, putting on a couple of events to tell small businesses about what might be available and what they need to do in order to conform to your buying processes, well, frankly, don't bother. I mean, what we want to see is much more detail across an organisation's processes about how they're actually going to achieve this. So I want them as individual organisations to think about what these principles mean to them, because it might differ. If you're a small rural local authority, you might think that certain parts of that sustainable procurement duty are more important than others. You might want to reflect that in your spending in a different way than, say, a large national agency. That's fair enough. But think about what it means for your buying organisation and how you're going to reflect that through your processes. And I don't see enough of that happening at the moment. That's not to say it's all bad practice, but I think there needs to be a more rigorous consideration of how processes across organisations can be changed to really genuinely achieve these aims.
Okay.
At first sight, this looks a very attractive and sensible proposal, and I think we would welcome and endorse anything that rebuilds the middle ground in Scotland, particularly for delivery of infrastructure. I mean, I've been in Scotland for, you can tell from my accent, for 30 years in the construction industry mainly, and in that time we've lost that middle ground. I think that you need a clearer definition of SME in this. I've puzzled about this, but I think you do. I think 250 employees, what does that mean? Does it mean 250 employees on the payroll, or does it mean they employ 250 people, including subcontractors and subordinate suppliers? And the conventional definition of SME, I think it is anything below a £50 million turnover. So I think on balance it needs to be that. As it's drafted, I assume that it's meant to apply only to local authorities. I can't see how it can apply to anybody other than local authorities. And then I came to question whether or not local interests should have a priority over national interests, and whether local interests should have a priority over best value. And then to table them for CBI's policies, it doesn't promote the use of outsourcing. Now, outsourcing, setting aside all other arguments about outsourcing, in my view, is the sure way of giving more business to SMEs. What this is trying to do is to give SMEs a bigger share of the existing cake. Whereas if you increase the size of that existing cake by outsourcing more, then you'd increase business to SMEs. I think where administrations espouse there's a need for better relationships between employers and employees, I think it's wholly wrong to, by implication, demonise private enterprise. And I think this is a very, very important issue that this bill misses the chance of addressing.
Well, on the point, you said that Scotland's lost the middle ground in terms of size of companies over the years. Do you see this bill nurturing small businesses so that they grow and fill that gap?
I think it's probably a step towards that. But as I say, I think you have to, I don't think it is just that. I think it's one part of a step. But I think that's got to be the aim, is to rebuild that middle ground, because I think that's where we've lost a lot of our talent and skills. It's gone. Certainly from the industries that I've worked in since I've been here, we've done that. And I think that's a sad loss. The problem was, I think, the reason we lost a lot of these, that these businesses were family owned, rather than owned by shareholders, and I think it's a difficult thing. But I think Scotland would benefit if we did rebuild that middle ground. Yeah.
Right. Just moving on, do you see any conflict between the sustainable procurement duty and the general duties to treat suppliers without discrimination and to act in a transparent and proportionate manner?
I'm not a lawyer, although I sometimes sound like one, but I fear there may be. Yeah, I think there is. If it's not very carefully managed, I think there is a danger that this could have that these measures could create situations which are discriminatory. And I do see more work for my legal friends coming out of this bill, in advising local authorities on whether what they're proposing is discriminatory or not, and then advising bidders that didn't succeed to take civil action. Yeah.
Anybody else like that?
I suppose it's possible. I suppose there is potential for that. But again, given what we know of the risk-averse nature of most of our public bodies, again, I think we are some way away from them being accused of being discriminatory in favour of local small businesses. So,
yeah, I think an awful lot of local authority lawyers have spent an awful lot of time, ensuring that local authorities are as cautious as possible. I think it is important that we at least begin to make some steps towards rebalancing the position in the economy. I mean, I think the figures in the procurement bill consultation suggested that 45% of contracts by value went to SMEs, and SMEs obviously represent 99.3% of businesses in Scotland, which means that the remaining 55% is going to 0.7% of businesses. There's clearly scope there to draw a more a fairer line, if you like, among businesses in Scotland.
Thank you very much.
Can I just ask, is that a true figure? Because, you know, you're right in the figures, but then contracts will go to a bigger contracting body, but then it'll be subcontracted, so it's...
There will be business flows down from that, clearly, which is why I think we need greater transparency in the system. But, you know, the figures are fairly stark, and, you know, there is definitely scope in there for some degree of rebalancing.
If I may say, I mean, there are all kinds of hazard warnings about the data around procurement, because there are, whilst it is probably fair to say it's the best that there is in the UK, there are all kinds of difficulties with things that are not included in the data or gaps in the data. But nevertheless, I think that you know, the SME spending figure has remained constant, I think at least for the last 3 or 4 years, despite all of the measures that we've allegedly put in place to help them. So I think that there is still scope to improve upon that figure. And you know, I'm not saying we should put a target on it, but I think that less than half of our spending going to 99% of our businesses, I think there's still scope to do more there.
Okay. Jim, you want to go and look at specific duties?
Thank you, Convener. Good morning. One of the specific duties which the bill at Part 3 places on contracting authorities is the requirement for regulated contracts to be published on the Public Contracts Scotland website. So can I ask you, is this something that you support, and do you see specific benefits arising from it? So will it make it easier for companies to bid for and win contracts? And going back to Mr Rush's point in evidence earlier, does it have a role in addressing the issues around consistency and standardisation? Would it be helpful, unhelpful, or does it make no difference in that regard? So the requirement, first of all, and then what benefits would it have in respect of winning contracts, and then the issue around consistency and standardisation?
I think certainly Public Contracts Scotland has been a great step forward in terms of trying to codify what had been a very diverse range of contracts, not always published in a very consistent and transparent way. It definitely makes it easier for businesses to be aware of opportunities and to access potentially those opportunities. I still think there are some burdens which have not yet been overcome in terms of I suppose the amount of time that small businesses have to spend in some of the processes along the way. But undoubtedly, I think PCS has been a positive move. It definitely makes things more transparent, more open. It opens up opportunity. In terms of whether it's going to have the effect, you know, as Susan has said, you know, the value of contracts going to SMEs seems to have been fairly static over the past few years. We do need to see, I think, greater efforts made to easing the process. PCS makes it more open and apparent to businesses, but there's still processes in there that really are very burdensome, particularly for small businesses to deal with when they're bidding for contracts. And until we address both of those issues, the transparency and the ease of putting in tenders, then it's not until both of those issues are addressed that you begin to see positive changes, I think, coming in the SME market.
I think it's, you know, worth reflecting on where we were 6-7 years ago. I mean, at that point, you know, pre-McClelland, businesses there was no single place where contracts were advertised. You couldn't even find the contracts. So the establishment of PCS itself is a huge step forward. Having one portal for Scotland is a great step forward, and it really has made it much easier for small businesses to at least find the contracts that are available. As Gary said, actually winning it is another step, but actually having access to the opportunities, it's been a good step forward. I think this is one of those measures in the bill where ordinarily you wouldn't have to legislate for it. This is one of those things where, by and large, most public bodies will already be doing this and will already be complying. Nevertheless, there are a chunk of contracts, presumably between this 50k and EU threshold, which are not currently going through PCS, which will be after the bill, so that's good. That's more contracts going through the portal. And equally, you know, it's genuinely sad that we have to legislate for this, but I just don't think it's acceptable that any public body should be creating its own portal or its own way of advertising when we've got this great tool that businesses know about.
Just to be clear, you're supportive of the requirement that
Yes.
is introduced in the bill?
Yeah, I think that's right. I think it's a good step. Whether it'll be effective or not, I think you never please everybody. And the way that you're going to create more business for SMEs, I mean, there's two ways of creating more business for SMEs, and that's to increase the cake, as I put it, or to reduce the competition from larger companies. And I mean, larger companies, I know from experience, are quite fleet of foot in creating local SMEs. So, you know, I'm not certain that will necessarily have the desired result. I think one of the important provisions in this bill, which is new, is the requirement for contracting authorities to have procurement strategies. And I think I don't think you need to do all the work for companies in terms of making life easier for them. I think it's beholden upon companies, if those procurement strategies are properly drawn up, for companies to take note of them and develop their business model in a way that will make best use of those procurement strategies. So I think if this is going to be effective, it's a two-way it's a two-way relationship. I think.
Back to my original question, do you see a role for the Public Contracts Scotland website in facilitating the standardisation and consistency that you spoke about earlier?
Yeah, I think I do. I think it's part of the whole parcel. I mean, I think it's a good move. I think if you look back on what we said in the past about procurement, we're in favour of procurement bodies, not just like PCS, but certainly infrastructure procurement bodies that create more consistency and standardisation. Yeah.
Can I ask you, witnesses, do you have a view on the single point of inquiry for complaints? Is that something that could be burdensome to businesses or not?
Point of inquiry for
Um,
complaints.
Is that something you have a view on?
Yeah, I wouldn't think it would be burdensome to businesses. Again, setting up the single point of inquiry was one of these things that had been asked for pre-McClelland in terms of there's nowhere to go if you feel you've been treated badly. Most businesses are highly unlikely to want to complain directly to the body that might be a future client. And so we knew that complaints were not being made. There was no one really following up on what was going on. So single point of inquiry was established. I think, as we've suggested in our evidence, I think it's good to have that anonymous port of call for businesses to, or indeed third sector, to raise complaints about processes they've been through. I think the difficulty with it is how far can it go in resolving those complaints or addressing some of the issues that might be raised. If it's not, if legal rules haven't been broken, what can the single point of inquiry do? Because it largely relies on the business complaining, single point of inquiry officials basically liaising with the public body in question and saying, what's happened here, what have you done, do you realise you probably shouldn't have done it this way? And in some cases there will be a serious flaw in the process and the process has to be restarted. That's fine. In some cases everybody agrees to disagree and the process is dropped. But there are quite a number of cases where what has been done by the public body probably isn't good practice. It's probably recognised as something we'd prefer they didn't do, but nobody can tell them not to do it. And so the business feels aggrieved that they have been treated badly, but there's nothing technically can be done, and they've got no recourse. And at the moment, they have the SPOE, or they can go to court, and most small businesses just can't afford to go to court, so they feel that there's nowhere to go. So that's why we've suggested that there could be space for some kind of remedy in between court and SPOE.
I think, personally, I'm in favour of the principle of ombudsman, regulator, complaint body type systems. I think
we have that at the moment.
Well, I don't think we do in this particular case, but I think I was just going to say I think we have to learn from some of the problems that we're seeing in similar sort of single points of complaint bodies around the country. I mean, they're not actually they don't actually get good press just at the moment. The regulators and the bodies. And I think there's lessons to be learned. On the question, I think there is a slight difficulty about contradiction between that and the time frame for raising action either in the Sheriff's Court or in the courts. I mean, the provision here is 30 days to begin proceedings, and I take it that would conventionally mean begin formal proceedings by either issuing a writ or summons, depending which court you're in. So I think a complainant is then left with the dilemma: do I refer this as a complaint, or do I go straight to the courts? Sheriff's Court's not that expensive. I think if I was a small business and I was in that position, I'd go to the Sheriff's Court.
Mm-hmm. Are you thinking of the Ombudsman being an alternative to legal action? Is that?
I think it is. I mean, I think it would be in practical terms.
But I think that would have to be an amendment to the bill. I don't think that's something that is currently proposed.
Well, I mean, I think the practicality of it would be, because if you went to the Ombudsman, I mean, it'd be a very efficient ombudsman that's going to come back within 30 days, and that 30-day time frame, if you miss that, you're in danger of missing your opportunity to take legal action. And I think that's the contradiction in this. And I think if I was a small business in that position, I'd go off to the Sheriff's Court, which is not going to cost me a lot of money. It'd probably cost me less in making my case, as less as making my case to an ombudsman as making it to a sheriff.
Okay. Can I ask about community benefit clauses and the requirement that these should be placed on contracting authorities? Is that something you support, and the level of contracts to which they apply? I noticed in the FSB evidence that there was a suggestion that community benefit clauses must not become an unintended barrier to participation by smaller businesses. So I'd be interested in your view.
Okay, I think in general community benefit clauses or requirements are good development in procurement. It's a good idea to apply them to particularly sort of large capital projects. The 4 million limit, I don't know if anyone particularly disagrees with it, it's relatively high. I suppose it might be envisaged that might come down in future. So at the moment, at a 4 million plus level, it's unlikely that many small businesses would be involved at the moment. But I suppose our concern is about if CBCs, well, when they become mandatory, our concern is that it starts to become part of the pro forma approach to a project that we know buying bodies are so fond of in terms of getting into a way of doing things. And good CBCs are specific to a particular project. They recognise what types of community benefit might work for that particular project. It might not just be about construction apprentices, it might be other bits and pieces. And our worry is that if they start being slapped on every project, the buying bodies will take less time over constructing the CBC, and we'll end up just using a formula and saying we'll have 10 of that kind of apprentice, 10 of that kind of apprentice, 10 of that kind of apprentice. Now, the difficulty with that is that if there's no flexibility over how the outcome that you're looking for with the CBC, if there's no flexibility around that, you will end up putting up a barrier for a lot of local small businesses who can deliver the benefit that you're looking for. They do have a record on local training, they will be using local apprentices, but they might not be able to take on 10 of this specific kind of apprentice. And so that's our concern about how CBCs might develop. It might become just another kind of requirement that a lot of businesses can't comply with, but bigger businesses will be able to come in, no problem, and just say, yeah, we'll deliver that, we'll deliver that. And there is a wider issue about how you monitor that and make sure that those companies are actually delivering what they've said they'll deliver for a community benefit. Is having 10 apprentices hired who are sacked at the end of the 18-month project, is that a better outcome than having more small local businesses who will employ 1 or 2 local apprentices each, who will still have a job at the end of that 4-year apprenticeship?
My view on this is that with a threshold, it may not be a big issue, because we very quickly get into European directives in any case. So it may not be a big issue, but the idea of community benefit and contractors providing community benefits, I think basically is a sound idea. I think a lot of our members do it, and a lot of them do it voluntarily. I think if you're asking for benefits, they should be proportionate and they should be sensible. I think it's I think provided they are, I think it's a good thing. Yeah.
We're certainly supportive of the principle of community benefit clauses. Certainly at the levels, as has been said, that it is scheduled to apply. We think that the bulk of this bill should be about ensuring that as many SMEs as possible can participate in the procurement process. At the levels applied, we wouldn't expect that would necessarily in itself be a barrier. But of course, we wouldn't want to see any clauses attached in future which could be a barrier. So I think it's all about application, but certainly on the face of the bill, we don't see any major problems with that.
Has it been the case up to now that often community benefit clauses are passed on to the subcontractor, and really there hasn't been much discussion with subcontractors about, how best to implement the community benefit clauses? Do you have any experience of that?
Oh, I've no evidence to say that's the case. No, I mean, where I'm aware that community benefits agreements have been entered into. My experience has been that the main contractor has done it enthusiastically, and is probably in some cases provides more community benefit than has been asked for. I just don't recognise that as being a complaint.
I think up till now, a lot of the CBCs have been pretty good projects, been pretty well developed between contractor and the buyer. I suppose our worry is if they start becoming used more routinely, the time devoted to developing the right solution for that project will decline, and you'll end up with just a formula off a piece of paper being applied as CBCs, and that's where I worry we might get into difficulty in future.
And we heard when we were talking to the NHS about project bank accounts. Do you think that would help encourage more SMEs to apply for bigger contracts or public contracts in general?
I think project bank accounts is one way to tackle the issues of late payment through the supply chain. We certainly did ask Scottish Government to consider it, which they have, and I know that the Construction Review looked at it as well. It remains to be seen how effective it will be. I think the bigger issue is just more generally about business-to-business payment through the supply chain. There is obviously a requirement in the strategies that buyers will set out how the payment terms will be dealt with through the supply chain, in terms of expecting primary contractors to pass on payment promptly, but there is nothing around how that will be monitored. And we know from buyers that this is something that they really struggle with. If they ask a primary contractor to pass on payment within a certain period of time, how do they follow that up? And in some cases, there's the odd bit of monitoring that goes on, but broadly, I don't think that it is monitored at all. Does a requirement for prompt payment through the supply chain only apply to works contracts where you're talking about construction supply chain, or does it apply to every good supplied to the public sector and every person that a supplier subsequently pays through their business? So I think the intention to tackle this issue is right, because it's a huge problem for small businesses. I think the measures in the bill could help address that, but how it will be done, I think is still a little bit of information lacking on how we're actually going to make that happen and support our public bodies to deliver that.
Okay.
Suppliers has been a complaint as long as I've been in the industry. It's an awful long time. Principally, it's not a matter of won't pay. In many cases, a matter of can't pay. And I think you've got to be very careful in the way that you expand the system and introduce smaller companies into the system, that you're not putting them in a position of overtrading where they can't pay. And probably project bank accounts might address that. The other issue that troubles me with this is that what is the debt which is due? Is it the debt that the supplier or subcontractor claims, or is it the debt that the main contractor certifies as being due? And that's what I'm not clear about with this project bank account system. If it's a question of what is certified and is due, then I'm in favour of it. I think it's probably a good thing that it prevents this overtrading dilemma. But I don't think that it would be fair and reasonable or proportionate to put a main contractor in a position where he has to pay what is claimed.
Do the others have a view on that?
There's perhaps something to be said in there. I mean, I think there would need to be some kind of checks and balances to be able to determine, whether the sum being claimed was fair and reasonable. I mean, there may be issues between contractor and supplier, but there would need to be issues there. I think the main point is that in a regular standard contract where there aren't any major issues, are we creating a system that could make it slightly easier for a smaller subcontractor to be paid on time? This is definitely one potential solution towards making that more likely. So in that respect, it's welcome. But yeah, I mean, there could be issues with conflict between contractor and supplier that would need to be addressed. But I mean, perhaps that is an area where the courts would have to be involved.
The courts don't have to be involved. I mean, the Housing Grants Act, which came into law 20 years ago, I suppose now, was intended to address that very point about settling disputes quickly and payment quickly. The fact that it hasn't, I think we should learn from that.
Mark, do you want to continue with this?
Thanks, Convener. Touch briefly on sections 22 and 23 earlier, just to ask the panel what their opinion is on the government's proposals to address current workforce issues through guidance, for example, on inappropriate use of zero-hours contracts or on the operation of blacklists.
Okay, I think that we recognise that most people want action to deal with inappropriate buying behaviour, inappropriate practices by certain businesses we all feel shouldn't be getting public contracts. I think that's recognised generally. That's something we want to tackle, and setting out more clearly the terms in which you can exclude potential bidders on the basis of certain practices, I think is a good step forward, because our understanding is that certain parts of the public sector just feel very nervous about what they can do within the rules. So I think that's a good step forward. I think the difficulties for us arise around what will be encompassed by guidance on general workforce matters, because what's appropriate for a small business with 5 people might be a very different workplace policy for a multinational company, and that's where we start to worry about what this guidance will look like, what it will include, and whether it will again put up more barriers for small businesses. If it's just about saying blacklisting is the type of gross misconduct that we don't think is acceptable and you can be excluded as a bidder for that, that's fine. How we look at appropriate use of 0 hours contracts, how we determine what's appropriate, I think there are question marks over how that discussion is going to take place and how you would put that down in sensible terms in guidance.
I think I agree with all of that. I think the question of blacklist is an interesting one, because if it's a criminal activity, it's company criminal activity, then I can see some sense in its right to exclude contractors or suppliers that engage in criminal activities from bidding. I'm less certain about the idea of encompassing directors and employees, because the criminal system punishes them for that. And I think you've got to be very careful about that. I'm a bit confused in the bill. I almost took legal advice on section 22 and 23, but I thought it'd probably be more helpful if I reflected on my concerns about it. I think a sheriff or a judge would almost automatically consider whether he should issue an interim order to assist or stop the procurement process at the point that the formal proceedings were taken, and it would seem to me that that's in the public interest, because at that point in time the judge would either, sheriff would either issue that order, or he would decide that there's very little chance of the case succeeding, or it's vexatious, and I think the proceedings would be struck down at that point in time. So I think you've got to be careful about that, and I think that placing limits on the court only to award damages if a contract's been entered into, I'm not certain that's in the public interest either, because you might find circumstances where it would be dangerous or not in the public interest to continue with a contract if there's a case won against the authority. And I'm confused about the call-off provisions in here. I mean, looking for the ways that one would, the loopholes in this legislation. I wonder whether the call-off provisions in section 6.2b are a little bit confusing, and I think they need to be looked at. I think probably it needs to be struck out, that bit, because if it falls within a framework contract, it's covered by the provisions that they seek to exclude in 6.2b. Overall, I think you've got to be very careful about this. But I do believe that things were better when you could be given a contract, could be given a yellow card for poor performance. My experience in the industry was I think the industry benefited from that.
I think similar to what Susan said. I mean, certainly there are some activities that obviously we would want to drive these businesses out of the procurement process, where criminality or certain unsavoury practices are taking place. But I think caution in terms of sometimes interpretation. I mean, if you're talking about 0 hours contracts, for example, sometimes that is a positive and productive way of running a business, both for the business and for its staff, and sometimes it isn't. So I think there's questions there over how you judge maybe what's appropriate and what isn't appropriate. But by and large, I mean, certainly the intention of excluding some businesses who are operating some dubious practices from the process is something we would support.
I'll just make a point about zero-hours contracts and SMEs. I mean, a lot of owners of SMEs, I would like you to reflect, are actually de facto on zero-hour contracts. They only earn what they earn. There's no guarantees.
I mean, I've spoken broadly about, or broadly supportive about the government's proposals, but mentioned difficulties in implementation. How have you been able to feed any specific proposals or comments on specific proposals on the guidance through to the government?
Well, this particular section about guidance on workforce issues hadn't appeared prior to the publication of the bill, so this isn't really something that's had a great deal of... Well, there's been discussion about what are the problems we want to solve, where there's quite a lot of consensus, as Gary said, about certain practices we want to see stop. How you do it, the solution, the bill was the first time we've seen the solution. Now, that means that there are a lot of questions around what this will look like in practice. So we've had some initial discussions with Scottish Government, but I think there will be a lot more discussion to be had. So around things like, well, if we're asking about workforce issues, our understanding is that that will apply only where workforce, only to the workforce who are delivering the contract or to whom it's relevant, involved in the contract. But then that raises questions about, are we really only interested in the workers who will be delivering the contract? Do we not want to ask more generally about that wider business and whether other employees who are not delivering the contract would also be getting the good types of practices that we would want to see? How is any of this going to be enforced? How are we supposed to how are buyers supposed to consider issues which can't be included in a scoring matrix? I'm unclear about how buyers are expected to... They're supposed to use this guidance to help them consider how they select tenders, but I'm not clear how they do that and therefore what that might mean for small businesses. And our worry is that if buyers are encouraged to consider these matters, they will ask all bidders to supply information on all of these matters. And if that list grows and grows, you'll be very quickly back in a situation where you're asking bidders to submit reams of information, which might not be necessary in all occasions.
Okay, and in addition to those points on 0 hours and blacklisting, the government has also spoken about the possibility of using guidance to encourage employers to pay the living wage. Do the members of the panel have any comments on that?
Again, I would go back to the point. I think the intention of this bill is to encourage greater participation by SMEs in the procurement process and winning more contracts and winning more orders and a greater share of the value of those contracts. We would hope that all provisions and all guidance would be geared towards achieving that objective. And I think in terms of some of the issues that part of the bill is looking at, it's looking at areas of criminality and wrongdoing, failing to pay a living wage as opposed to failing to pay the minimum wage is not criminality and wrongdoing. Clearly it would be a policy intention for government, but we wouldn't want any policy intentions to create new barriers for the participation of SMEs in the procurement process and introduce new costs where costs didn't exist before.
I think it's okay. So our understanding is that the guidance from the Commission says that it's not possible to attach any criteria for wages that are above the set national minimum wage. So it can't be a criteria for contracts. Beyond that, how do you encourage people bidding for contracts to pay the living wage? Our difficulty is, again, as I said earlier, how is that to be considered in any way by a buying body if it cannot be included in the scoring matrix? I don't understand how, if you were a business paying a living wage and one who was just paying the minimum wage, all things being equal, I don't understand what the difference would be in terms of how you would select one of those businesses if it cannot be a criteria. I suppose more generally, it's a lot of small businesses will say to you that they'll be more than happy to pay the living wage for certain contracts if the buyer's prepared to allow the contract to be bigger. But if your public sector's only prepared to pay a certain amount and not prepared to increase how much they will pay for a service, but the wage costs are going to go up by 20%, just can't reasonably expect small businesses to remain competitive and want to bid for that. They're just not going to bid. And you will be in a situation where larger businesses who can carry the cost or absorb it elsewhere will be able to commit to that, and they will win the business, and the small businesses won't. So I guess it's a judgment about how we achieve this and what the outcomes are that we're looking for.
I really nothing else to add to that. I personally not in favour of imposing conditions that require suppliers or contractors to pay anything other than the minimum wage, because the minimum wage is set in law.
Okay, just move on to another part of Part 3 of the bill. There's a range of proposals to increase transparency, but particularly on the provision to offer a debrief and provide information for unsuccessful bidders. Do you think that's enough, or do you think there's anything else that could help particularly small and medium-sized businesses who've been unsuccessful, to help them gear up towards the next tender?
I think that proposal is helpful. I mean, it does happen in many cases at the moment, and certainly speaking to, I mean, recently, for example, speaking to a lot of businesses who had bid for work during the Olympic Games, and the process that was involved in that, the learning process that then allowed them to make successful bids for the Commonwealth Games contracts, for example. That learning process was extremely helpful to them. And I think for any business getting involved in public procurement, maybe for the first time, and looking at the scoring they receive at the end, it is helpful to understand and to gain an understanding of how that scoring was arrived at, and where they can make changes and successfully bid for contracts in future. So, whilst there is a huge amount of frustration in bidding for contracts that are unsuccessful because it involves quite significant costs, particularly to small businesses, positive feedback in terms of how that business can then go and make successful bids in future is extremely welcome. So it's certainly the minimum we would expect.
Yeah, I mean, I think if you speak to procurement specialists that work with small businesses, they will say that feedback's absolutely critical to small businesses understanding what it is they need to do in order to win more public sector business. It's really important, and it has gradually got better in recent years, so that the quality of feedback has improved. But it's still important to be able to get it, and so having the right to ask for it, I think, is good. It's important that suppliers have the right to ask for that feedback. The concern is around how meaningful the feedback is. And I think the bill's probably gone as far as it can go at the moment in terms of reaching the right balance. But I do understand the concern that a buyer would have, that they can't possibly write chapter and verse to every single bidder setting out how their bid could be improved. I understand that. But equally, businesses don't want to just get a completely anodyne letter that just has 4 options of why they're unsuccessful with a tick on it, which doesn't really provide them with the feedback that they need about what was wrong with their particular bid or what areas they needed to improve with their particular bid. So I think it's fine. I I don't want it to develop into a bland tick box exercise, and I want businesses still to be able to ask for more meaningful, in-depth feedback. Not everyone will do that, but where they ask for it, I think they should get it.
I feel a little bit guilty in agreeing with that, because I think we're in danger of putting a huge burden on the buyers in terms of complying with this requirement, particularly where there's a large amount of bidders. And I think that's one of the issues which is not addressed in here. In my experience, one of the major complaints that bidders have in bidding for contracts, particularly complex contracts, is if there's too many bidders, there's too much competition, and the more you open it up and increase the number of tenders and number of bidders, the more work you'll be giving the buyers in terms of feedback on why individual companies didn't succeed. So the principle is absolutely right. I mean, transparency and feedback, but is it going to be practical for contracting authorities to do it effectively? It would be my question. But if they're happy with it, I'm delighted.
Adam, you've got some questions on Part 4, the remedies.
Yeah, thanks, Convener. Could I ask the panel, is the remedies regime for sub-EU threshold procurement necessary? And if so, are the provisions appropriate? There seemed to be some difference of opinion in terms of accessibility to quotes for small firms, for example.
I suppose to a certain extent we've all kind of pitched in on this already. I mean, we don't have any particular views about this section because we genuinely think most small businesses are not going to use the court option. I think it's important to have that there so that there is a sanction for, so that public bodies know they have to comply. There will be a sanction at the end of it. But I think it's unlikely that most small businesses will use this remedy. There may be issues about whether it opens up opportunities for more unnecessary court action by some bigger businesses, but I don't know if others want to comment on that.
No, I would just agree. I think the Sheriff Court is generally seen as an expensive place for small businesses to seek remedies. I don't know whether the Scottish Government's plans to review the operation of Sheriff Courts in Scotland will assist in terms of making it a more affordable place to seek a remedy. But I think, yeah, at the moment it is seen as being an expensive option, which probably most, certainly micro businesses to small businesses, would probably not consider.
I'm not certain whether small businesses will use the Sheriff's Court or not. I suspect more will than people anticipate. I think the apart from what I've said previously on this, I think this part of the bill has a remarkable effect of making it the responsibility of the supplier or contractor to hold the contracting authority to account and not the government. I think it has that remarkable effect of moving the responsibility on. I don't think that's a good thing. I think it's up to I think it's up to the government. I think the government has the ways and means to hold contracting authorities to account if they don't perform their duties and obligations to procure it for best value that already exist.
And how do you suggest to do that? The government does that?
Well, they can do it through the annual settlement with the local authority. Reduce their grant,
Okay.
as an example.
Yeah. I can just envisage the.
That may be politically not palatable, but what I'm saying is that this bill moves the responsibility to the supplier and the contractor. Personally, I don't think that's a good thing.
Okay, fine. Could we perhaps move on to a final question? Are there any areas of procurement reform that should be included in the bill that haven't been, as far as you're concerned, or enhancements that could be made to it? For example, last night we had a session with businesses, and one idea that came forward at the table I was hosting was that the procurers, the contracting authorities themselves, they ought to scale up in terms of the people who are dealing with the contracts. Is that something that we should be including in the bill, for example?
I think it's something that you should be doing. Whether you should include it in the bill or not, I don't know. I mean, my experience, both as a supplier and a contractor, and as an advisor to public bodies on major infrastructure contracts, is that the main difficulties are lack of skills in procurement, a rush to meet timing and budget requirements, and moving the risk profile from the supplier back to the procurer. I think they are issues that McClellan tries to address, and I think they've still got to be addressed. Whether you should enshrine that in law, I doubt, and whether you should make it then the responsibility of the contractor and supplier to hold the procurement authority to account, as I said, I fundamentally disagree with that.
Okay, just a couple of things. Yeah, I mean, there are many factors to procurement reform, many aspects of the process that need improved. Should all of those be on the face of a bill? Probably not. Two things that we hope that the bill will achieve, if not on the face of the bill, then certainly through the guidance. One would be how you encourage some kind of presumption in favour of the smallest practicable lots for contracts. One would hope that would be achieved by the need to think about proportionality and helping SMEs, but I think we could possibly go further, and I would like authorities to have that as part of their strategy, how they start off from a presumption that you use the smallest practicable lot size. And as I'd mentioned as well, I think making sure that the general duties apply to all of the procurement processes within an organisation and not just to the regulated contracts. I think that would also send an important signal about making sure that we get those kind of practices and standards we want to see applying across the piece and to the many sub 50k contracts which most small businesses are bidding for.
Yes, I would just reiterate, I think that I think the bill itself will achieve so much. But what it's really focused on is ensuring that the best possible deal for small businesses, that small businesses are able to access opportunities and to increase participation in winning contracts. I think in terms of how you can go further in terms of ensuring that happens, I think there's an awful lot to be done beyond the bill. We have been on the process for a very long time, certainly McClelland all the way through Supplier Engagement Working Group, etc. There's been a lot of talk, a lot of, I think, understanding on the part of government, certainly, of what needs to be done. But it's a case of ensuring that what government understands is transferred to the purchasing authorities, and that the purchasing authorities are given the confidence to make the right decisions in terms of ensuring that more business goes to small business and SMEs in Scotland.
Okay, thanks very much.
Okay, does any other member of the committee have any further questions? Any final comments that the panel would like to make? Well, can I thank you all very much for your evidence today. Can I thank Susan, the FSB, for their written evidence? Look forward to having written evidence from the other two organisations. And can I briefly suspend this meeting to allow the witnesses to leave and the second panel witnesses to come in? Thank you. Okay, if we can move quickly to agenda item 2. In the second panel today on procurement, we will hear from representatives from social enterprises and the third sector. So can I now welcome Pauline Graham, Vice Chair of Social Enterprise Scotland, Annie Gunnar-Logan, Director of the Coalition of Care and Support Providers Scotland, Neil McShannon, Managing Director of Clydesdale Community Initiatives, and Duncan Skinner, who is Chair of Glencraft. Can I perhaps start the session by asking the witnesses, do you think the bill will deliver the policy objectives of establishing, I quote, systems which are transparent, streamlined, standardised, proportionate, fair and business friendly? Who would like to start? Duncan?
Happy to start. Yes, and the answer is no, Maureen, in respect to the business that I represent, Glencraft, which is a small social enterprise with 45 people and £1.4 million turnover.
I should probably declare yes.
Indeed, and unfortunately, our contracts don't exceed 50,000 threshold, and therefore don't generally come under the parameters of the bill, unfortunately. And expanding on that, I do think that the 96% of public procurement that is incorporated in this bill, or previous procurement statistics and some of the paperwork that was handed out, the £5.75 billion that does come under the parameters of this bill generally will include some of the products that we supply, but they get wrapped up in a single procurement from a larger company, and companies like my own don't get the chance to participate in these larger contracts. So I think it's a significant flaw that is not in any way addressed in this bill. And the public procurement elements that could be supplied by supported workshops or supported businesses and social enterprises that supply smaller individual products within a larger procurement. I would like to suggest that something be done about that within this bill, whether it's a percentage of the value of any procurement contract, a single procurement one-stop shop contract that has to deliver not just the community benefits, but must have a certain amount of business done with social enterprises within their procurement or within their bid. Because try as we might at Glencraft, we cannot get these people to speak to us. So I do not know where they're getting their mattresses from, and that worries me as well in terms of certification, supply chain condition, etc. So the answer is no, in short.
Okay, we'll probably come back to that. Would the others like to? Yeah, Pauline.
I think the issue of streamlining and levelling the playing field for social enterprise suppliers whom I represent, a lot of good work has been done through the reform programme, and I see the bill as an extension of the progress made around supplier engagement initiatives and process issues. So, for example, standardising the PQQ, having a system around standardisation, I think is good, because that was one of the biggest barriers to actually getting through to the next phase of a procurement for social enterprise suppliers who are pretty small. So the standardisation of the PQQ, the mandating all contracts to be on PCS is incredibly helpful. But not just that. The idea of contracts registers, which is in the bill, and in my view, the idea that we would have suppliers can have sight of what procurements are being planned. So forward purchasing plans means that smaller suppliers can be more procurement ready, more ready to respond to the opportunities that are coming down the line. And also, I think the idea of using community benefits, which obviously has to be on a case-by-case basis and be proportionate to the value and component of the contract. But all those component parts, I think, will go some way to realising the policy ambitions of the bill.
I like the forwarding purchasing plans concept, do you see that being perhaps in the organisation's procurement strategy that they've got to publish or not?
I would hope it might be linked to that there would be a commitment within the strategy that they would do that. And as part of the contract register, so what contracts have been awarded, I would like to see what contracts are being planned.
Yes, because I mean, I think the government has tried through its infrastructure investment plan to sort of show what the pipeline of work is. So you're saying that you'd like to see that from other contracting bodies?
Yes.
Right, okay. Annie?
Thank you, Convener. The answer to your question is yes and no, as always. I'm here representing the third sector organisations that provide social care and support right across the board, children and families, disabled adults, learning disability, older people. And in our part of the forest, I think public procurement gets something of a bad press because of the nature of competitive tendering in social care and support and some of the impact that that has had, which I can go into.
Specific question on that, so we will come back to that, but in general terms.
In general terms, the bill goes some considerable way towards addressing some of the more acute issues that are there, but it could do a lot more, and there are some quite specific asks that we have of the bill in relation to this particular part of the supply chain, if you like. I'm often before a committee saying I'm not here to indulge in special pleading, but actually today I am. So,
session that you'll be able to get all your pleas in, Neil.
Again, I sit in the yes and no camp, and I sit in a couple of different camps as well, in as much as we contract for kind of construction type and landscaping activities. We have found the use of PCS extremely good, extremely positive. But in terms of the larger contracts, I would agree with Duncan that where it's a one-stop shop, then where there are subcontracting issues within a large public contract, it's very difficult to see an opportunity to access where a smaller organisation might be able to deliver a service through that. And the community benefit clauses, which you would think might be an opportunity to address this, can often be quite vague. There's a lack of creativity in them, and kind of a lack of understanding about the potential that the community benefit clause has to kind of engage with social enterprises.
I think then, Mary, that through your question, you might be able to probe further in what Duncan was talking about.
To carry on the theme of how the bill assists social enterprises and third sector organisations to bid for and win contracts. And I accept that there's a range of views across the panel as to how successful that's going to be. And we've heard in previous evidence sessions that this is seen very much as an enabling bill. So, would it be your view that more needs to actually be put into the bill, more amendments need to be put in to encourage your organisations or to ensure that your organisations can be part of the process, or should something be put into the guidance?
I think I would prefer to see it in both, to be perfectly honest. I think it is the intent is commendable. There's no question about that. It's in the execution and the interpretation, and in some cases the manipulation of the words that in practice that is the problem. We have had legislation in the past, such as Article 19 and other such commendable thoughts. We've had framework agreements in place. In fact, Glencraft have had a national framework agreement to supply mattresses to national and local government for 18 months and have had not one single inquiry, having won that tender 18 months ago. So it's not working in practice. So I would suggest anything that can be done to mandate that mechanical putting into practice of the good intents of the bill should be done.
Okay.
I think as somebody that goes for tenders and contracts, I would be fully in agreement, and as much as we see the contracts coming up, and we have won a number of contracts off PCS and some quite large ones, but it has been purely on the basis of quality and price, and kind of the additional community benefit hasn't actually played a part in any contract that we've won to date.
So, do you think the community benefit clauses should be beefed up, if you like, or strengthened?
Absolutely. I think that on two levels. Like, I think first of all they could be much more creative in terms of, and I can see the difficulty for kind of a commissioning agency, commissioning a big construction project. What do they know about kind of health and welfare? Like, and that's you know, it's a fairly serious ask for them to take into account. Well, how can this building project benefit the health of the local population? And they would therefore require to work in partnership either with their health or social services, local social services, in order to generate that creativity. But I also think once it gets, if it's a large contract, I think it gets diluted when it gets down to kind of the subcontract level, where within kind of like a major construction project company, they again have no expertise or knowledge of health and welfare issues, and therefore when they're looking to fulfil the community benefit clause, they'll pick the easiest, which is to work with a regeneration company to do what they would probably have already done, rather than to go seeking for a social enterprise that might have more specialist outcomes.
Annie?
Thanks, Mary. I think I'd answer your question in two parts, really. I mean, the larger third sector organisations are already very significantly involved in delivering public contracts in care and support. I mean, you know, up to a third of all publicly funded provision is in the hands of the third sector. So access to the market is not the issue. What the issue is at the moment for a number of those organisations is whether they're going to stay in the market, frankly, because of the rates that are on offer. And we may well come back to that later on in the discussion around Section 24 and other aspects of the bill, because for us it's the ratio between cost and quality when we're actually awarding contracts that is significantly problematic. The second part is that for the smaller organisations who are support providers, I think there is still an issue about access to the market for them, simply because of the burden on tenderers of filling out, you know, immense. I mean, Duncan's smiling at that. He knows all about that. You know, the kind of the rigmarole of actually bidding for a public contract and the amount of paperwork involved, and the fact that often, in our experience, it's the organisation that writes the best tender who is awarded the contract, not necessarily the organisation that provides the best service. And how does a paper-based exercise discriminate between those two categories? So I think there's kind of a whole load of issues in how you can assist the third sector to access the market, but also to be more effective in the market, which I think is a slightly different issue.
And I suppose the other thing to think about when the bill is trying to encourage innovation, and quite often it's the third sector and voluntary organisations that are the most innovative, but they miss out. So if that was built in as well and included in guidance to almost signpost your organisations, because you do provide that added value.
Yes, and I think it's the extent to which a competitive tendering exercise is able to unlock the innovative potential in an organisation, as opposed to just saying, will you please provide this thing that we have already specified in advance. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Pauline?
Yeah, a couple of things I'd like to say on that. If social enterprise suppliers are willing and able to enter the public procurement market and able to deliver good quality service, then they can only do that if the buyers actually engage with them. And this relates to your point about innovation as well. So there's not enough market engagement between the buyers and the suppliers. And certainly from my perspective, that's something we've been trying to do for some time, with support from the Scottish Government, is to bring the buyers and the suppliers together and try and break down some of those cultural barriers and organisational barriers, to understand where social enterprises are, what they sell, what the quality of their product or service is, and particularly when they haven't actually had a contract or they haven't had any engagement with a local authority or NHS. So market engagement for me is very important at the front end. The sustainable procurement duty in the bill is fine and it's progressive and it's laudable, But when you see that translating into the procurement strategies and reporting against that, for me there are two things. One, sustainability needs to be at the heart of those plans and strategies, and I think it's diluted a little bit. And any guidance around what a good sustainable procurement plan looks like ought to have sustainability issues at its heart. And the second thing is, in terms of reporting against those plans, there has to be some accountability to say, have I actually delivered against the sustainable issues? Because procurement people are very good at procurement. So sustainability is quite new to them in terms of how they wrap that all up into a procurement exercise. So they do need some guidance, and I, for one, do not want to put any more burden on procurers. But they want to work with their sector. They're very willing to engage with their sector, but they just need some tools and leverage to do that. So I would like to see sustainability issues in its broadest sense, including social enterprise supplier issues, at the heart of those guidance around the strategies.
There was an event in Parliament last night, and there was businesses in, and the table that I was hosting, there was a discussion around how to include small businesses, and that included third sector and small enterprises. And one of the suggestions that was made last night was if larger organisations that bid for contracts had better local knowledge of who was in their area and what services they could provide, and instead of those very small organisations that do provide very good and very innovative services having to go through a system of subcontracting, if the larger organisation just directly put the contract to them without that whole subcontract bit, that would encourage the participation of more organisations like the ones that you represent. Would you agree with that?
Presupposes they speak to you in the first place. Yes. That's exactly what's required. I mean, we need to be, you talk about innovation, I mean, commercial innovation here and relationship building between public and private and third sector is vital in this area. And coming from an oil and gas background, we did it all the time. The large companies like the Wood Group and the companies that I worked with were these large contractors that contracted directly with the Shells and BPs. But it was incumbent upon us to know and have very, very strong links to our supply chain, who we're reliant on for 80% of the value of our contract. We don't seem to get that, in my experience, in my current predicament. But I would certainly encourage the education of these large contractors who do get these large contracts through public procurement tendering, and encourage them, educate them and encourage them to contract in a frame agreement, a relationship, a single source supplier, some kind of simple agreement. By just talking to us, by coming and looking at our factory and seeing the CSR potential that they may have, and the development of their own people by understanding a third sector organisation staffed by disabled people, they would be humbled into giving us business, and we can compete, as we do every day, in the open marketplace against other manufacturers of the same product.
But then how could that be included in the bill? Would you say that should be in the guidance?
Again, I see no reason why. I think the bill doesn't cover the supply chain as such in as much detail as it might otherwise do. Guidance certainly, but again, mentioned earlier that I think there needs to be some kind of direction or percentage or allocation in large-scale procurement that has to, similar to the community benefit, it has to apply to third sector social enterprises. And then they would go looking, because they know they wouldn't succeed without having that element in their tender. Once they established a relationship with a good company, then they wouldn't have to look again. They would just automatically include them with their prices and the relationship that was ongoing. So that inclusion or compelling that element within their tender may lead to a long-term relationship and solve that problem.
Okay. Pauline.
I think the importance of community benefit clauses can't be underestimated in the discussion that we've just had, because we've got some really good examples of where what you've outlined in terms of social enterprise and small business engagement has worked on big contracts. And I was involved in supporting a very large contractor who won part of the Energy Assistance Government Programme. And there was very specific community benefit clauses in there and very good reference points, and I was one of the reference points. So when the contractors were at the bidding stage, they had somebody to phone to say, I want to work with your suppliers, where are they, where are that? And we were able to give them access to a register of social enterprises, which made it much easier for all concerned, the suppliers, the contractor, and the buyer, to see their response to that community benefit clause. And when they won the contract, they came back and got into a room with social enterprise suppliers in the energy assistance field and said, we want to work with you. And that meant that it didn't need to go through a tender process as such. It was a transparent process, but it wasn't. It didn't have to go under the procurement regulations. So it was a very positive experience. I would like to see more of that. And I know the bill does suggest community benefit clauses requirements in major contracts. I would like to see something beefed up a little bit within the bill about permission to use community benefit clauses. And I do a lot of work with procurers around this. And there are a lot of procurement officers throughout Scotland who already use community benefit clauses, who adopt a policy around it, and that then gives them permission to do more of it and to embed community benefit clauses within, or certainly to consider community benefit clauses in all that they purchase. And so it's a kind of business as usual. And that's what I would like to see the bill encourage, and as I say, probably beef it up a little bit.
Okay. If I could just come back on that, that's exactly what we want to parallel with the social enterprise or supported businesses. It's working with community benefit clauses. Why shouldn't we do it with third sector supply? And what that's going to do is encourage more third sector participation in industry. And there's certainly a great need for not-for-profit organisations supporting lots and lots of people and innovating and becoming a larger part of the public spend through being able to compete on a level playing field.
Can I say that as the managing director of a construction company, I am in complete agreement with Duncan and Pauline, and see reasons for optimism in the bill if we can beef up the community benefit kind of requirement down through the supply side. As the managing director of a health and social care organisation, however, I would be much more sceptical that that is going to work. And as much as I have seen over the last 20 years of working in the social work, that the large voluntary sector organisations have become contract-winning machines, and that your capacity to engage with them in kind of innovative and flexible services is practically non-existent. And I suppose the phrase I often use is that they have, there are notable exceptions, but they've often become kind of public sector light, and it's just the contracts that are issued very rarely kind of see the benefit of kind of the innovation and flexibility that the smaller third sector organisations can bring about.
So unless there was something in the regulations to say a percentage of the work that you get must come from, that's the only way you could resolve the issue that you've raised, is it?
I'm not even sure that would work, because as Annie said earlier on, I think that while they're winning contracts, they're winning them largely on price, and that if they came to me and said, right, we want you to deliver a service, like, I am quite likely to say, well, no, I wouldn't be able to deliver the quality that my board would insist on, and my participants and clients require at that price.
So it's too much focus on price. We should be looking at other things as well as price.
Aye, absolutely.
Yeah. Annie?
Yeah, just there are contract winning machines, if only that were true. I think there are some alternate models of procurement that can help to facilitate this kind of approach. I mean, Pauline and I have been very involved in looking at some public social partnerships, which kind of lifts the service contracts out of the competitive tendering machinery, and actually requires organisations to collaborate in the performance of a contract rather than to compete for it. And in those models, you often find that the smaller organisation is able to access that kind of market much more effectively. We're still in kind of early days around that. But the other thing I'd say about it as well is that model enables much more of a kind of holistic view, in the sense that you're not asking for organisations who all do the same thing to be competing with each other. You're actually asking a range of organisations who all have different inputs at particular points in somebody's care journey, to be able to play their role effectively wherever that might be. And I think there's lots of potential there. But in order to make that more effective, you really do have to do something about this kind of rush to compete everything. Which is one of the main issues that we're facing, I think.
Yeah, not an easy problem to solve. No.
Sorry, can I just come back quickly, because I mentioned public social partnerships, and as Annie said, we're quite involved in developing and supporting public social partnerships as part of the government's Change Fund process. They've adopted PSP model, and also there's some strategic public social partnerships, which, as Annie said, gives us a chance really to do a proper co-production. So the public sector and the third sector providers come together and have basically redesign a service specification and pilot it over a period of time, and then it goes to competitive tender at the end of that process. It's a very innovative model. It's very specific and unique to Scotland, I'm proud to say. And whilst we don't have all the answers, as Annie says, there's a real opportunity here, I think, to reference public social partnerships and some good examples to date within the guidance or the implementation around the bill, to give, again, it's about giving procurement commissioners the permission almost to not go straight to retendering a service, but actually stop and review and reflect and work with third sector providers to redesign a better service. And the biggest thing for me around PSP is service users are at the heart of that process, and that's something that we don't see within the current regime in Scotland.
And just very briefly, taking into account everything that you have said, are the proposals in the bill clear and easy to understand for the third sector organisations, including the different levels of procurement that are there?
Yes.
Yeah. Simple question, that's good, thank you. I like that. Thank you, Convener.
Yep. Before we move on, can I just clarify something? I mean, social enterprises and third sector, a myriad of different organisations within that. What you want really is to be seen as an organisations that can compete with the private sector in getting public sector contracts. And then to me, there's a kind of separate issue of community benefit. So you're involved in both, as a body that can tender for contracts in the public sector, but you can also come under the community benefit clause. And I think, you don't necessarily want, I don't mean this in any derogatory sense, but you don't want to kind of always be considered as the community benefit. You want to be seen as bodies that can, as I said, contract and compete with the private sector, if you like. Would that be correct?
Yes, it's a very good point. And that's what we do all the time, because we do no business with the public sector. But we would certainly like to increase our employment, grow our business through doing good business with the public sector. But yes, we need to guard against sweeping these people into a corner and calling them supported workshops or blind asylums, as they used to be called. But I think but there's a balance. There is a social dividend to be paid in terms of operating with us, because our people can't produce as quickly or as efficiently as they can in overseas countries, etc. And I do think there's a social dividend to be recognised for doing what's right within Scotland and sticking to our values and working with those that are less privileged, giving them dignity through work. That's worth a lot to our people, and it should be worth a lot to the Scottish procurement policy.
Yes, I mean, for example, when Jim and I were taking evidence in Inverness, we heard that the new college, the catering provider for the workers on that is the Calman Trust. Now, I'm not sure, we'll need to go back and check whether they won that competitively with other private contractors or whether that was part of the community benefit clause of that contract. But these are the kind of things that your organisations can be involved in. Okay, let's move on. Jim, you want to
thank you, Convener. I'd like to stay with the issue of procurement and social care that we've begun to discuss this morning, and I'm mindful that the Health and Sport Committee that has conducted a range of inquiries into the subject has highlighted the importance of good commissioning and procurement practices as a driver and determinant of quality, and you've begun to touch on the tension between price and quality. So perhaps we could just kick off by asking what you see as the opportunities arising from the bill in terms of its impact on social care provision.
Two issues we've got with social care and tendering in particular, competitive tendering in particular. Your starting point has got to be that care and support is often a long-term arrangement for individuals. And so if you feel yourself as a procuring authority under pressure to re-tender a contract every 2 years or every 3 years, then you're creating this climate of instability and disruption so that individuals have no idea who's going to be supporting them after the retender. The care and support staff have no idea who they're going to be working for, in effect, after the retender. And you get this kind of cyclical instability. And I think for the interest of this committee, the disincentives that offers to suppliers to invest in a service in any kind of way or to invest in their workforce if they think that it's just going to kind of pass to somebody else in a relatively short time is very strong. And I think it also is in very direct conflict with legislation passed earlier this year by this very Parliament, no less, which is the Self-Directed Support Act, which is in effect wanting to place decision-making power in the hands of the individual service users, not in the hands of the contracting authorities. So there are all those kinds of problems going on. And the second issue is the impact on quality, because what we have seen is I hate to use this phrase because it's not racing to the bottom, it's actually being dragged to the bottom on the part of a lot of organisations. And it comes back to what I was saying about a paper-based procurement exercise, in our view, being structurally incapable of determining service quality or a provider's capacity to deliver it. So inevitably cost becomes the kind of dominant factor. It's not necessarily the contracting authority that wants it to go that way, it's just the way the system works. So our worry is that we're seeing rates for care and support kind of plummeting, really, to the point at which payment of the living wage becomes almost impossible, and I suspect we might get onto that later on. In some cases, payment of the minimum wage becomes actually pretty difficult within the rates that are offered. So it seems to us... Is
that because of the pressure on local authority budgets, or the budgets of those that are...
But this started even before that, I have to say.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, the competitive tendering in care has been happening, well, for decades, actually, in some respects. But since the publication of the 2006 regulations, which is when the kind of EU procurement directives came into play, I think authorities have felt under much more pressure to retender and do that much more regularly. And whether they wanted to or not, the effect of the competitive tendering process in care is to drive prices down. And our concern is that we've now got to the point where the kind of the skills and capabilities of those who are procuring, I'm trying to say this in a way that doesn't sound kind of overly critical. On the other hand, why the hell not? You've got commissioning authorities who do not understand the cost of delivering a service. Yeah, the way that the cost is made up is entirely the supplier's issue to worry about. And I think that we are really at risk of driving down quality. We've already driven down terms and conditions for the workforce. And I think it's starting to have an impact. We've just done a survey of all of our members, and 84% of them are now looking at care and support contracts and saying, I'm not going there. I'm not going there because, as Niall was saying, you cannot guarantee the kind of quality of service that you want for the price that is on offer.
In terms of the workforce issues that you've mentioned around minimum wage and living wage, I mean, that would go against the intention of this legislation. Did you see an opportunity through the bill to actually counteract that trend that you've just described? And, for example, on quality, is there an opportunity or not to further strengthen the regulatory regime by perhaps extending the powers of inspection and intervention on the part of the care inspectorate? Or is that not really the issue?
Yeah, inspection, I mean, if you look at care inspectorate information, you'll find that third sector care and support is streets ahead of either private sector or public sector, in fact, when you look at the quality gradings. So we're already there. But what the care inspectorate has concentrated on is inspection of the quality of the service, not inspection of the quality of the commissioning process. And that's what we're after the Care Inspectorate to do more of. I don't think you can do it within this bill. I mean, I've got my eyes on the Public Bodies Joint Working Bill around that, because I think that's where the role of the Care Inspectorate can be brought in. What I think is important about this bill is the sustainable procurement duty specifically, and how authorities can look to improve, I mean, not just the economic and social well-being of the area, but if I was going to get my hands on that one as an amendment, I'd add something about and benefit the recipients of the service, which is the subject of the contract. That's where I'd put that in. And then you've got section 24, which is about the, potentially guidance on things like living wage, 0 hours contract, treatment of the workforce, and I think that would go a very long way to helping some of this. But our primary objective in relation to this bill is to have care and support contracts taken out of scope of the requirement to compete.
And that's something that this bill could achieve. It was,
yeah.
Or excuse me, would that require an amendment to the bill, or would that be done through
well,
guidance?
you could probably do it through the clause on excluded contracts, which is section 4.
So we can expect to see some amendments.
Would that help? Would that help you?
Yes, it would. I'm aware that it sounds kind of...
Wouldn't be any regulation for local authorities or commissioning bodies to, to meet the requirements of the bill in terms of living wage and stuff like that?
Well, you'd have to do it in such a way that you excluded social care contracts from the requirement to advertise and compete, but included them for everything else. So, in other words, you give much more discretion to local authorities about whether they advertise and tender a social care contract. But where they decide to do so, then the provisions of the bill apply.
I
stunned you.
I think that's... I'm not easily stunned, as you probably know, but perhaps for the first time, yes. And I think I'd be interested to know what the other witnesses have to say on that.
It might not be a surprise to Annie that I fully support what she's just outlined in terms of a much lighter regime, if you like, for care and support contracts. And some of my members have complained about the things that Annie has underlined in terms of over-procuring, and there are lots of two-play implications around some of that as well, and nobody seems to think enough, in my view, about the end user of the service having to change provider all the time, and as Annie said, it's generally a long-term package of care. So I fully support a lighter regime. If that's through an exemption clause, that would be absolutely fantastic. And as Annie said, it's really just about giving more discretion, I think, to buying authorities to stop and do the thinking around why am I retendering this? Actually, if the service is working, and it also might get them to think much more strategically about evaluating their services in terms of the current provider, the incumbent. I think that will be helpful in terms of the service quality, and that's something that we've mentioned quite a lot. So, and the last thing I would say on that is, in the context of self-directed support, services need to be delivered in a different way. Providers need to be up for that challenge, but also procurers need to be up for that, and commissioners need to be up for that challenge as well, when there are individuals who will choose the type and quality of care that they want.
I should perhaps add, Jim, at this point that the text of the revised European Union Public Procurement Directorate is very much in line with this. It specifies social services contracts as, it's established a much higher threshold for a start, €750,000, I think, which a lot of current contracts in Scotland would breach. So, it's not kind of lifting it completely out, but it does say that social services contracts should be subject to a much lighter touch regime. And in our own guidance, which was published in 2010 by the Scottish Government and COSLA, there is provision in there for authorities to have it gives them much more latitude in relation to whether they will retender and retender and retender, or whether they will actually just be able to roll contracts forward where there are no performance issues. But I think what we have the chance to do in this bill is to give that a bit more welly, because I know with your previous panel, and maybe you've heard this from other witnesses, there's guidance coming out of our ears on a lot of these issues, but it's not got enough force behind it. So that's what we would be able to do in this bill. So it may have sounded kind of slightly outlandish to kind of land that on the table with you this morning, but it's not. It is the direction of travel that we're going along the road to in social care.
So we might not have to push very hard then to get the outcome that you're seeking.
Well, one can always hope.
Thank you.
We heard in evidence in Glasgow, I think. Adam, you were at a different table from me, but is it not that some local authorities in particular regard your sector as a kind of soft option? In other words, they wouldn't treat private contractors the way that they do third sector organisations, for example, retendering more often and driving down prices more often than they might do with the private sector. They wouldn't get away with that with the private sector.
I think in terms of competition, probably not, actually. We are competing with private sector organisations for these contracts, mostly competing with each other, I have to say, which can be a very destructive business. There are some ways in which kind of post-procurement the third sector is treated rather differently. I mean, I'm thinking in particular of local authorities who want any surplus on the contract given back, which I think some private sector organisations might have a conceptual difficulty with, and yet that is expected of the third sector. But it's not really what I would say would be part of the procurement process, although in some cases contract clauses do stipulate that. And I think most private sector organisations would have a very short answer for a local authority that wanted to do that, but we seem to give in.
And maybe I can bring it in here as well, and now you kind of alluded to this. The third sector often we have heard, problems with Scotland Excel and the fact that contracts are kind of bundled together on a national basis. Now, when we had Scotland Excel in here, they refuted any suggestion that I made that they worked against localism. Can you maybe comment?
All I can tell you is my experience, which is that it is extremely difficult to kind of introduce a new social care product to the market, in as much as, say, you know, we run a landscaping company which we use as a platform on which to deliver kind of health, social care, training and employability. It doesn't tick a mental health box, but it does have mental health outcomes. But it doesn't tick necessarily a kind of a daycare box for adults with learning disability, but it is an alternative to daycare service. But essentially, the big issue that I have as an organisation is that by the time health and social care contracts come to the procurement end, it's the specifications are drawn up such that we would be excluded on two fronts, both as the fact that we probably wouldn't have the capacity because we're a small local organisation and our capacity for health and social care is dependent on us growing a landscaping business, which makes life a bit tricky. But also that the specifications are kind of too broad and there isn't a box for kind of social enterprise-based health and social care outcomes.
On Scotland Excel specifically, I mean, there aren't that many national contracts for social care. I mean, the one that's there's one on fostering, there's one on secure care, and there's one in development on residential care for children. I suppose that the issue that a lot of third sector organisations have with it isn't necessarily about Scotland Excel itself. It's about who's doing the buying and what are you buying and whether these two knowledge sets actually coincide. And we're actually seeing that within individual local authorities as well, that you have kind of corporate procurement in charge of letting contracts for social care, but the people who are running the procurement, really their knowledge base of social care is zero. And at the same time, you have social work services departments letting contracts for social care, but their knowledge of procurement is not great either. So it's how you kind of marry up the skills and capabilities that's the key issue. I mean, in relation to the residential childcare contract, I think the key issue for most third sector organisations is that it excludes 40% of the market, which is the in-house delivery. And it's an exercise which is supposed to be about driving up quality and addressing capacity issues, but it only applies to external providers, which is 60% of the market. And none of its provisions apply to the local authorities who deliver directly. So as a kind of commissioning exercise, it's missing almost half the services that require attention. And I think that's where the issue comes up with Scotland Excel.
Okay, we better move on. Alex.
Thank you, Convener. I wanted to move on to issues about the threshold for contracts and ask you in the first instance, do you support the introduction of the new regime for below EU threshold contracts, and what will the implications be for your sector?
I think I've already given my answer. I do think it's imperative that this quite significant gap from £0 to £50,000 is bridged somehow for small businesses, or at least considered within the bill. Otherwise, what happens is that it becomes abused or forgotten about through the use of P cards and totally unregulated procurement, for which I get none. So it's not working for me, so I can't say that the bill does anything to help that in its current condition. So the thresholds for larger procurement, perfect sense to larger companies, but they don't speak to SMEs and small providers. Although, as I said earlier, a lot of small providers, or a lot of the products that small providers can supply and do supply are included in the 5.75, 96% of what we're talking about here. It's just that it's all hidden and rarely accessed by third sector companies. I can't make that point more strongly.
Yes, I'll comment on that one, if I may. And it relates to what I was saying about the way in which the EU principles of non-discrimination and equal treatment of suppliers are interpreted by authorities to mean that they have to go through a cyclical process of retendering every 2 or 3 years. Because what this, as written, what this bill does, in effect, is apply those principles to anything over 50,000. So the pressure on local authorities to retender relatively small value contracts in social care is going to increase rather than decrease, which is what we want to happen. And if you look at the threshold of 50,000, it's not inconceivable that a care package for one individual might actually exceed that threshold. I mean, it wouldn't in the EU terms, because 750,000 is a lot of money, but 50,000 in social care and support terms for some people with complex needs is not unlikely. So unless we exclude contracts, social care contracts, from the requirement to advertise and compete, it seems to me that we might end up having to retender individual support packages on a 2 and 3 year basis, with all the impact on disruption and continuity and stability that I've talked about. So that's the worry that I've got about the threshold. Otherwise, it would seem entirely reasonable. And I think to marry it back up with the self-directed support legislation becomes even more complicated, because here you have, at the moment, you've got authorities who are trying to make sense of the EU principles and their duties under procurement legislation with their duties under self-directed support legislation. And the way that a lot of them are going is, in effect, to let a framework contract from which individuals will then be able to choose their provider. Now, that seems to me to be completely contrary to the spirit and actually probably the letter of the self-directed support legislation. You can choose any provider you want, as long as it's from this list that we have pre-specified through a framework contract. So for all of these reasons, this is why I'm kind of pressing this issue of removing care contracts from this requirement to compete. And the threshold becomes really quite significant if you look at it that way.
In general terms, though, the choice has been made as to where to set the thresholds. Do you think the thresholds are in the right place or the wrong place, or have you any alternative suggestions?
Well, it seems very low for social care contracts for me, unless we find some way of giving authorities more latitude around the principles.
Yeah, I would probably agree. In some senses, because you look at 50,000, you say, well, you're opening up the market and the competition, and that's got to be a good thing. So I think but that has to be caveated by, I guess, Annie's point around care again, which is it will make people more risk averse, so they will just go through the process rather than be risk pragmatic, I guess, in procurement terms. So I think it's what the wording it is around the thresholds, but generally I don't have an issue with.
Well, I wear two hats. As a construction manager, I think it's reasonable and should have a positive consequence. But as a health and social care person, again, I would agree that it will potentially cause problems by getting back into a cycle of over-procurement.
I'm interested here that there is a range of views on this subject, and that some of them are really quite complicated in relation to the subject itself. Can I sort of round that up by asking, how were you consulted by the Scottish Government prior to the publication of the bill about issues in generally, but specifically about issues relating to the thresholds? Were you consulted? Did you get the chance to have your say?
We've had very positive engagement with the Scottish Government Procurement Directorate around all of this. I mean, Pauline and I sit on the Public Procurement Advisory Group, which is a kind of excellent an excellent body and has given us a lot of say on behalf of our constituency of membership in the development of the proposals. On this particular one, what was consulted on in the exercise, the pre-bill consultation exercise, wasn't what's ended up in Section 8. What was consulted on was a duty to be proportionate, transparent, etc., etc. It wasn't putting the EU principles into domestic legislation. And I don't think there was a specific proposal that was consulted on about thresholds. It was, people's views were sought about thresholds, but it wasn't, 50,000, what do you think? It's not the threshold itself that worries me. It's the translation of EU principles into domestic law, which is the driver for all the retendering that we've seen. So I did get a bit of the willies when I saw that, I must admit, because that was not part of the consultation.
Interesting that is remarkably similar to a view we got from business organisations earlier. Does anybody else have a similar or a different view on the consultation process?
To see very positive on the Procurement Advisory Group, continue to be engaged around the process of the bill, also on the Supplier Engagement Working Group, which brings together private, public and the third sector colleagues, and also I think Annie as well, we were both involved in the bill sounding board and a separate group around the bill looking specifically at social and environmental measures. So we've been very heavily involved, and I guess that's why we're here today, because we feel like we have a vested interest in getting this right.
From our perspective, I wouldn't have expected to be consulted as such a small business, and certainly appreciate the invitation here today to give evidence. I think as a third sector or a social enterprise, we might have merited just a note to make us aware of the Section 10 elements of the bill, the few paragraphs that do refer to social enterprise. But the first we kind of got was an invitation to come here last week. So. But I can fully understand that we are a very small element, and the proper social sector organisations have obviously been consulted on it, which I'm fine with.
If I could just make a point that we were consulted, but through Social Firm Scotland and Scotland. Mm-hmm.
Thank you very much. It's an issue I look forward to raising with the Minister at a later date.
Okay, if we move on to general duties and procurement strategies, Gordon.
Okay, thanks, Convener. We touched earlier on the sustainable procurement duty that states that contracting authorities must consider how it can improve the economic, social and environmental well-being of the authorities area, and also facilitate the involvement of the third sector bodies and supported businesses in the process and promote innovation. Do you think the bill will achieve these aims, and if not, what are the barriers that are stopping us from achieving these objectives?
Mm-hmm. Yep. Thank you. I might be in danger of repeating things that I've said earlier, but I think they're important within the context of your question. Very much welcome the sustainable procurement duty. I think that's really what I wanted to see, was sustainability at the heart of this, and I was a bit noisy when the bill changed its name from sustainable procurement to Procurement-Reform. So, however, can it achieve its ambitions around this? Yes, if it's policy driven. So individual authorities, I think, who come under the regulations here need to think about their own policy outcomes in terms of how they do procurement, how they buy anything, how they commission anything. So for me, it's about policy adoption, and that's when people start to think about what their organisation is there for, whether you're a local authority to serve citizens in a geography, or a NHS board who clearly are around health improvement and health prevention and health treatment. So for me, it's got to be policy driven, and I would like to see some of the guidance around, again, how that duty translates into strategies and reporting against those strategies, to consider clear links with the buying authority's policy objectives, but also with the National Performance Framework. So I think you can actually see that duty being translated very well in terms of national outcomes, local outcomes through single outcome agreements, and at an organisational level I'd like to see the sustainability issues addressed through the procurement capability assessments. So you've got national, local and organisational, and I think that will go some way to making sure that the duty is in fact as effective as we want it to be.
I think Section 9 is very, very good. I think it's really important. I mean, public bodies are already under a duty of best value. I think what Section 9 does is starts to articulate what that might look like in relation to the letting of public contracts, which is why it's very helpful. I think I said already that I would add something to it, which would be that contracting authorities also ought to consider how the individual recipient of the service, which is the subject of the contract, will also be, how their well-being will be improved, not just the kind of general area. So I'd want to make it kind of a bit more specific to the individuals who are at the heart of this. As far as, how will it be effective, as always with these things, it depends how it's monitored and who is going to hold anybody to account for any of it. So the idea of the annual report, the annual procurement report there, I think is important. I think it also relates to some of what the bill says about remedies, which I don't know if we're coming on to that later on, but there's a kind of thread between all of those provisions, I think.
Anybody else want to come in on that? No.
Yeah, I think the sustainable procurement's commendable. I do think there are elements that probably aren't for this bill that need to be addressed, and that is the supply chain or the follow-up audit. I think everyone breathes a huge sigh of relief when these big procurements are tendered, the tender process is finished, and the contract is awarded, and the follow-up to that and the audit of the supply chain from an ethical perspective, from a source of supply perspective, I don't think I see very much of that going on in any industry, and I do think that it's an element that should be expected of this amount of spend and these scale of contracts, that the integrity of these contracts is questioned from time to time and audited from time to time. We have the resources to do it. The question of value is one which is very difficult in any procurement situation, and it generally the fallback is a decision based on price, and that's what we find everywhere in our organisation. I don't think that's we need to be more innovative and more advanced in our thinking as to what value is. I talk about mattresses, or a mattress that lasts 5 years longer than another one has a different value to it than a cheap import. We don't look at that, we just look at the bottom line price, and that's the wrong way to go about it.
So how would you address that in practice then, the balance between cost and quality then?
I think technical specification within the tender needs to be not just there to be bid against, but it needs to be verified. Mm-hmm. And again, longer term supplier contractor or supplier procurer relationships with intermittent checks of certification, documentation, quality of process, the actual treatment of employees, etc., is very important. We'd like to see much more of that coming out of public procurement, just the same as we do in oil and gas and other private procurement.
I just wondered if that came under the section about procurement of recycled and recyclable products, the fact that I can attest that your product lasts longer than others. Whether that comes under that.
It
probably does, but I'll give you an example. We tendered for a massive contract to supply Unite with student accommodation mattresses earlier this year. It came down to a request from them for us to supply a mattress for a student at £36. Now, the material cost of our product was more than £36. So I'm not very happy that my son, who's a fourth-year student, is being subjected to that level of price competition that could damage his health long term. And that's the way that our bright young students are being treated. And that's the output, the outcome of what's happening in reality in quasi-public procurement. I've spoken to the universities concerned and their principals, and they were horrified. So things are hidden, out of control, and very worrying in that respect. So anything that can be done, it's just a simple, small example. I don't think it's properly policed, and I don't think quality comes into the decision-making process nearly as much as it could and should.
Who was the lead in that instance? Was it the procurement office of the universities, or
it was it was the Unite national agreement. They supply many universities. So it was a national contract we were bidding for, and the procurer for Unite came back and pushed us on price, and we lost the contract. So I don't know who won it, but I shudder to think what quality is involved if that's the price they're delivering it at. So,
thank you.
Okay.
Well, I just want to ask, in relation to the sustainable procurement duty, do you see any conflict between achieving the sustainable procurement duty and the general duty to treat suppliers without any discrimination and to act in a transparent and proportionate manner? Do you see any conflict in that?
As Duncan said, it comes down to the specification, as long as it's very clear about, and I would say the specification both in terms of the product, but also if there is to be a use of a community benefit clause to promote the likes of innovation, flexibility, the ability to use a smaller organisation. If that is clear in the specification, then I can't see that there is a conflict there. I think where there is potentially a conflict is if it's not specified, and what happens is that the contract manager has to fulfil kind of a prelim obligation or that kind of thing, and essentially goes out and finds somebody that can, without having given it any real consideration.
I can see why that might be a worry, because in clause, here we go, anorak time 1A2, you're actually kind of promoting SMEs and third sector, and then in the general duty you're actually supposed to be treating everybody equally. But I think where that's coming from is that current arrangements are perceived in themselves as being discriminatory at the moment against SMEs and third sector. So I think all it means is that it's part of the duty to consider how those organisations are able to get into the game. What I don't think it means is that those organisations, having entered the game, are going to have some kind of automatic advantage over anybody else. So I'm not too worried about that. I mean, on the points that the colleagues have made here, you know, I think we want contracting authorities to be rather more discriminatory than they are at the moment between a quality product and service and one that is of poorer quality. And unfortunately, you know, what we are witnessing in our experience is that the tendering process is not really capable of making that discrimination as it stands.
Okay.
That's why this duty is so important, though, and its component parts. I think the references to those component parts around the duty are welcome. What I was a bit sad about was the early version of the bill said that if you're doing procurement, you have to demonstrate in conducting that procurement you will improve the economic, social, environmental and well-being of that relevant area. And then we've lost the demonstrate to a rather weaker consider. I'm not sure if I'll win that argument at this stage, but I would certainly like to see seriously consider. Otherwise, procurers, will consider and then not do it. So that's my only point.
Okay. Right, Jim.
Thank you, Convener. Just briefly, could you say what you consider to be the benefits of placing contracts onto the Public Contracts Scotland website, assuming that you do consider that to be something that provides benefits?
From a supplier or a provider point of view, just to have the one portal is terrific. And it's a shame that we've had to put it in a bill to make it happen.
Okay, that's helpful. The community benefit clauses we've touched on. Is there anything further that anyone wants to add to what they've said already? And don't feel you have to.
I think the community benefit clauses reference in the bill as it stands are fine in terms of the major contracts, and the other reference to as and when. However, I'd also like to, I guess, again, it's about that permission and encourage to embed community benefits always at the front end. So do the thinking, and if you're not using them, almost say why. And make reference to service contracts as well. There's a big emphasis, I think, in general on community benefits in construction and employment and apprenticeships. I would like to see encouragement more widely on service contracts.
Okay, and happy with the level at which they apply?
Yes.
Thank you.
Mark?
I'd just ask witnesses what they feel about the government's proposals to address workforce issues, particularly around inappropriate use of zero hours contracts and blacklisting.
I just wanted to add something to that, because I think this, I'm looking at section 24 here in particular, and I think it's kind of interesting that this provision has been conceived of as a way to deal with poor providers. But I actually think it's a way to deal with poor contracting authorities, because our complaint about a lot of procurement is that it has driven down wages and terms and conditions in the third sector to levels which are not sustainable. But it's not in the title of the bill, it is there. As I was saying before, I think that has happened because of the way that the tendering process is constructed, but also because the idea of a short-term efficiency saving, efficiency in inverted commas for an authority, is kind of very attractive, and the risk is always that you're going to kind of take that. And so you have providers that are bidding in at levels which would not sustain the living wage, or even in some cases the minimum wage. So I think this is a way of ensuring that contracting authorities have to have regard specifically to the terms of engagement of the workforce, which will include things like the living wage, and I think that's a good thing. The difficulty is that they will then have to find the money to pay for it. As I said before, a number of our members are now looking at tenders and saying, well, we just can't compete on the kind of price cap that has been put onto this, because we won't be able to pay a living wage to our staff. So I see this as really important, not to regulate the behaviour of providers, but to regulate the behaviour of contracting authorities.
Although I wouldn't be allergic to blacklisting suppliers if they were found wanting in many respects, but not employees.
Okay. On the living wage, the government have said that they will encourage employers to pay the living wage, but they've said that because of EU rules they can't enforce it through this legislation. What would your opinion be of a clause in the bill which required the contracting authority to then enter into negotiations with the successful bidder on how much extra it would cost in the contract to pay the living wage, and then it becomes more a matter of policy for that contracting authority as to whether they're willing to pay that additional cost and whether that could be a way of delivering a living wage through it. It's a way of getting around that legal requirement, but still having a clause in this bill on the living wage.
Post-award.
Post-award.
Not a chance. No, that just introduces an element of low-balling your bid and negotiating it up later, which would certainly not be a way I'd like to see procurement going. I think a level playing field that is minimum living wage would be exactly where I would want to be with anything like this.
I mean, I would totally agree. That's where I would want to be as well. But on the basis that government advisors and government themselves are saying that they aren't able to and they won't include a particular section, the way I'm envisaging it is that a contract is won on a particular price, and then the successful bidder is able to tell the contracting authority how much more it would cost to pay its employees a living wage on that contract, and then it's up to the public authority to decide whether to take that step up or continue to offer the contract as it was originally won.
There's two things about that. One is, in the competition, you are disadvantaging the employers who already pay the living wage by favouring the lower price employer over it. But secondly, I think you might find yourself in really hot water with the procurement regulations, with the contracts regulations around post-award negotiation. I mean, it's not to say it doesn't happen. What sometimes happens with our members is that you win a contract on your quality submission, and then afterwards you're asked to drop your price, which is that process completely in reverse. And I think that is highly suspect in either direction, actually.
Margin and profit rather than the employee's back pocket. Certainly the world I come from, our customers dictated the wage agreements that they wanted in their tenders. And that's the way it works, so that you do not compete on wage costs. You compete on efficiency and productivity and various other costs, but wage costs are a level playing field, and I think anything that can be done to encourage that should be.
I think that's true. It's a very complex area. I think it's like an ethical issue rather than a procurement fix issue. I think we would always support the living wage across the board. Complexity on what you're suggesting, Mark, is that the idea that people will win on price and then be asked to and then be given additional money to do something else. It's very difficult if you're a large provider and you've got contracts with different authorities and or no contracts. Perhaps delivering things not in a formal contract agreement. And if you have different wage structures across one organisation, just because this contractor says you must be a living wage, then that would cause all sorts of problems. So it's a very complex issue. I think it's an ethical one rather than a procurement one.
It does raise the question I mentioned earlier about supply chain audit. Is there ever any follow-up to an audit on the supplier wage costs? I doubt it.
I'll give you a quick example of some of the conundrums faced by providers in relation to this question. A local authority let a home care contract which said, and we want to encourage our providers to pay the living wage, but when you actually divided the number of home care hours by the contract value, you discovered that it was impossible to pay the living wage within the envelope that was in scope. So this idea that somehow we're going to encourage people to do it, I just don't get it, because the whole point of introducing this through procurement is that you level the playing field for everybody, and you no longer have a competitive advantage by not paying the living wage, which is what you have at the moment. And I'm not entirely sure I buy this idea that it's not possible through the EU. I mean, I think you can't put it in the award criteria, certainly not. But if we use Section 24 in such a way that guides contracting authorities around their selection criteria, we might be able to do something about it there. But as I said before, I think the legal niceties is almost a sideshow to this. It's actually finding the money to do it, which is going to be the big issue.
I have actually seen on a pre-qualification questionnaire which we completed for a tender recently, I've seen the question asked, do you pay the living wage and do you use 0 hours contracts? And it was in the quality aspect of the PQQ. And I was delighted to see it, and I thought, like, particularly against quite a number of the competitors who we regularly lose tenders to, like, that will be interesting to see how it pans out. But so I don't know whether or not that's legal or illegal, or so I won't name the specific body that did it, but it can be done.
I just wanted to say something briefly, Convener, from me about 0 hours contracts. Because I think that there are some circumstances in which 0 hours contracts are perfectly all right. I mean, a lot of care providers run 0 hours contracts for their relief and sessional staff, which is entirely for the convenience of those staff. And going back to self-directed support, you cannot realistically have a situation where people are saying, no, I don't want to go to bed at 6, I want to go to bed at 2, and I don't want someone on a Thursday, but I would like someone at the weekend, unless you are able to kind of meet the flexibility of the workforce and the flexibility of the service in some kind of way. So chucking out all 0 hours contracts in our field, I think, would be pretty disastrous. The other thing I'd say about it is that if you look at a framework agreement contract, what is it if not a 0 hours contract? So some of the poorer behaviour around 0 hours contracts on the part of providers is being driven by the market environment, which is going much more towards framework agreements, and all a framework agreement is one almighty 0 hours contract. So if you really want to kind of stamp out the practice where it's inappropriate in the suppliers, then you actually need to deal with the commissioning and procurement behaviour on the part of the contractors. I think that's really important.
Just finally, on the proposal to increase transparency, particularly through offering debrief information for those who haven't won contracts. How do you feel about that, and the depth of information that should be provided to unsuccessful bidders?
Something, again, my previous industry we got all the time, but we didn't get too much value. The value really is in the customer conversation up front, in terms of assessing needs and responding to that. The debrief, I don't place too much store in it, because the procurement, unless it is very, very deep and meaningful, it's not going to change behaviours. It's just going to move on to the next one, sort of thing. So I wouldn't waste too much time with it, in my experience.
We're quite supportive of it, not least because providers are increasingly resorting to issuing freedom of information requests to contracting authorities to release the details of the winning bid, so that they can see exactly what it was about that bid in relation to their own. And I certainly don't think that's the way we want to go. So I'm very supportive of much more kind of detailed debriefing. And I was talking to the Local Government and Regeneration Committee about this, and one of the things that a debrief can expose is some of the absurdities in the tendering process. For example, we had a member who was debriefed on their bid and said, now, if you had put that information under question 4, we would have been able to allocate a score to it in our evaluation process, but because you put it under question 2, we couldn't, and that's why you lost the contract. So, it's that kind of thing that I think debriefs can help to expose.
I agree, but it's not that helpful, and it's very expensive to deliver, and I find that it's backward looking. If there's something you can learn from in terms of how you went about the tender, and you had a fundamental gap in your understanding of the tender or your provision of service that can help your company going forward, yes. But I think a lot of it's lip service, in my experience in private sector, but I haven't.
I think it's important, and I think the bill covers it well, and it's incumbent upon the unsuccessful tenderer in the main to ask for a debrief and to ask the right questions when they're in that debrief. So I think it's important it's in there, and I think what it says about the debrief is absolutely fine.
Adam, do you like to remedies?
Yeah, remedies question that Annie was looking for. Is the remedies regime for sub-EU threshold procurement necessary, and are the provisions appropriate?
Well, it's all based on court action, and so most third sector organisations would not, they'd really have to be pushed pretty hard to take court action. I was interested in your previous panel where the speaker from the CBI was talking about it moving responsibility for monitoring, which we mentioned before, of compliance with the provisions in the bill to the provider rather than to the sponsoring Department of Government, which I think, I'm not quite sure I agreed with his remedy, which was, I think, to kind of cut their local government settlement in revenge. But it's an interesting idea. But I'll go back to the McClellan report, because there was a specific recommendation in there that there would be some kind of appeal arbitration process which was short of court action, but a bit more powerful than simply lodging a complaint. And we've never done that. We've gone some way towards it with the single point of inquiry, which I think was a very, very helpful service. But for my money, it needed some more teeth. And that was our response to the consultation around this. Just some independent arbiter. Which is not a sheriff, yes. And not as expensive as a sheriff to access. Some have called for an ombudsman, if you like, in between the single point of inquiry and a court. Yeah, and ombudsman type person. We would support that, but it's not here. Okay. Anyone else? I agree with that.
Probably. Yes, I sit on the single point of inquiry group as well. And it has been a very useful service. I would say it's probably been under-resourced at times, so people perhaps had to wait a bit longer to get a response to their inquiry. I don't know why that is, but that's certainly my view. But the service itself, I think, has been very helpful for suppliers in the main, and our job, along with the Chambers of Commerce and FSB, was to look at the trends in terms of those inquiries, and they were generally complaints. Nobody came to the single point of inquiry and said they've had a really good procurement experience, so it was generally complaints, and I would like to see the single point of inquiry either strengthened in some fashion, or indeed the idea of an ombudsman. I would support.
Transparency in the tendering process, more professionalism should do away with the need for follow-up. Everyone hates losing, other than the person, the company who wins. So they're bound to have they're bound to want somebody to blame or some issue. I'd rather see the resources pointing in audit, continuous audit, and follow-up. To assure the integrity of the supplier delivery is matched to what he tendered on an ongoing basis, rather than wasting too much time on something that's really probably not going to change the original decision. Yep. Albeit there have been some fairly major rolling stock procurements in the past that have been changed. But
yeah. Okay. Final question, although you've been pretty clear in terms of what you would like to see in the bill that's not in the bill, or likes of the exemption, Annie, are there any other enhancements or asks that you have for this particular bill?
There's some very good stuff in the 2010 guidance on procurement of care and support. which could usefully be emphasised either by bringing that guidance into the scope of statutory guidance under this bill, whereas at the moment it's kind of just free-floating guidance. It's not under the provisions of any particular piece of legislation, which may be why it doesn't, maybe not as effective as it might be. So either it needs some updating, but that would be a useful process. The bits that I would pick out of that, if it can't be done, I'm very interested in placing further duties, always. And one of them would be for a contracting authority to assess the risks and benefits of any procurement exercise before embarking on it. And the reason why I say that in relation to care and support is because that is the latitude that authorities currently have about whether they will retender an existing support arrangement or not. They need to assess the risks and benefits of doing so on the individual, on their family, on the workforce and so on. And we find that doesn't really happen very frequently. So that would be one that I would pick out. Another one would be around the development of specifications of the service, which will be the subject of the contract, and who should be involved in that. And obviously the individual and their family and the community, it seems to me axiomatic that they need to be involved in developing the specification, and at the moment they're still not. And I'd go further and argue that providers ought to have some kind of not in decision making, but certainly in some kind of scope to offer the expertise that they have around what the service should look like, because otherwise we just keep retendering the same specification that we had before, and the scope for innovation that colleagues have mentioned just isn't there. And the last one would be, again, it's a direct lift from the social care procurement guidance, and it says that contracting authorities must ensure that the price tendered is adequate in relation to the quality of the service required. And I don't think that happens. I don't think that happens at all. We're seeing now a lot of home care contracts that have a price cap, and we're looking at this and saying, really, £10.50 an hour, £11, you really want a quality home care service for that? And we've challenged a couple of authorities and said, help us break that down. Once you've paid for the staff and the compliance requirements and the management and the overheads and the supervision. And the response we've had is, well, that's the provider's business to work all that out. And I think that's shorthand for we don't know, but we like the price. So I would like to see a much stronger link between price and quality as a responsibility, not just of the provider, but of the contracting authority, and particularly in care and support, I think.
Okay. That sounds fairly comprehensive to me.
My list.
Suggestions? Any other suggestions?
I just wanted to ask something about training. I'm not sure in any of your evidence sessions today had training been mentioned.
Can I say it's been an overarching theme throughout all our evidence sessions, training on both sides. So yes, we'll certainly be making a big thing about that.
Thank
yes. Anyone else? Duncan.
Just a small point on the supported businesses, the definition and the ability to ring fence a contract to be tendered only by supported businesses. There can be, and I'm not sure if this is the case, but there could be instances where there is only one supported business capable of supplying the service. My concern is that a procuring authority might say, we can't use that clause because we can't establish a competitive environment within that sector, therefore we'll just not bother. So I do have concerns about that.
Definitely ask the CAPSEC when she comes in about that.
Thank you.
Okay. Right, that was a really interesting and very helpful and informative session. Can I thank you all very much for coming, and that ends our business today. The next meeting will be next week, the 4th of December, when we'll be taking evidence from 2 panels on this bill. We'll be hearing, and we'll also be hearing from the Scottish Housing Regulator. There's an early start next week, but we'll let you know when that is. Okay, because there's quite a lot of business to get through. Yeah. Yes, we did agree that earlier. Okay, close the meeting.